the fence rests, let's lay it down. Gonna dig deep, wave that verdict round. The defense rests, time to analyze. With the evidence, we'll unveil the crime. Justice served in an honest fight, true crime tales till the verdict's right. Solving more than just trivial quests, where sentences rule at the defense rests.
Hello, y'all. Yes, there certainly was chaos in the background, little turd. I've rearranged everything to include that couch right there. He was there. I had to rearrange the whole set out of the page and everything, and then the little fuck jumped off. Shit happens. Good morning, good morning, good morning. How are we? Happy Monday. Happy Monday. Hello, welcome, Chloe with Spunk. Woohoo! Thank you very much for subscribing. Now, you know there is no escaping now. None whatsoever. Very welcome. Welcome. Good morning, Christine. How are you? I believe you're streaming Judge Middleton. Ah, did she? She's an angel. She's an angel. I've been trying to get hold of her, but I keep missing her. We're either streaming at the same time, or I'm asleep, or she's asleep. What else am I? Hello, Anna. Good morning. Good morning. Good to see you. Haven't seen you in ages. Who else have we got? Hey, Brian. Morning. Has everyone checked the poll? And I've got crazy hair. I just washed it, and it's just ignore it. It is what it is. So I have two options. Oh, what's that popping up? It's great to see you too, sweetheart. I've got all three of Steve's books, and the first and the third I have in a PDF form, which I will need to read out, or I have the middle one, which is actually quite good, which I thought was what we would do today, is the one that's on the screen, Death Penalty Debates. It's an audio book. And I'm sure we can get, it's 3 hours long, but it's quite easy to listen to at like 1.3 speed. It's not too fast. And it is really interesting. I don't know. Steve obviously is coming on to the podcast on Saturday, and after listening to this book, I'm not sure we're going to be able to fit everything into one stream. Like, there's too much content to give it justice. Does that make sense? Like, so I might see if he's interested in doing like a trilogy series to dedicate an entire stream to each book, because they're just, I've never actually heard it described and explained so clearly and so conclusive. Like, he's thought of everything. So yeah, I did put a little clip up of the first bit of the audiobook, and he's spot on with the debate between pro and con, and he says it in the most easy to understand way as well, so without being pretentious or arrogant, or it's just Yeah. Anyway, so I think we'll yeah, I think we'll start with that one and listen, because let me just see if I can speed 1.3. Now, if it is too fast, tell me. Oh shoot! Sorry. Can you hear me all right? Because I've is that better? I actually went back to my old audio setup. So is that better? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Are we there yet? All right. I shall press play. Do let me know what the sound is like, please.
Preface. The capital punishment debate arrived at my door.
Okay, no, I'm going to have to boost it. Oh dear, what have I done? Ooh, come back here. Ah! Where'd you go? There.
First step in the form of Ron DeSantis' political campaigns in 2023. The trial and life verdict for Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland High School shooter, caused quite a stir in Florida and across the country. Obviously, this case was a charged criminal prosecution in which there was no other side. Or was there? The jury of 12 voted 9-3 to impose a life sentence rather than death. The backlash from the community inspired then Governor DeSantis to push new death penalty legislation through the Republican-dominated legislature. The governor and his allies understood current death penalty law forbade both legislative enactments, but DeSantis was testing whether the Supreme Court majorities have shifted sufficiently to allow more liberal use of the death penalty. First, the legislature lowered the threshold for the jury to impose a life sentence from a unanimous 12-person jury to a non-unanimous 8-4 vote being sufficient for a death sentence. In Ring versus Arizona, U.S. Supreme Court 2002.
Oh, sorry, I probably should have given you a bit of a an intro on it. So, first book is basically it's a like a true crime novel, so to speak. So it's a mock trial where he goes through and explains what actually happens at the trial stage and how the process works. The second one is about the actual debates about and within the death penalty legislature itself. What it, I've got some. I'll put some notes down. So it's got they're not my bookmarks. The fuck? Why is it just repeating the same friggin' thing? Ugh. I went through meticulously and did all these bookmarks so that I could refer to them, and god damn it. What the hell? Bookmarks. Come on. Oh, hang on. Ah, sorry. My bad. I need new glasses. All right, so it goes into things like the wrongful convictions and the error rates, and whether an innocent person is protected under federal laws, and the imperfection of appellate courts, wrongful conviction and judicial advocacies and the weaknesses in that, how law enforcement officers view the defense attorneys, how basically, the death penalty comes down to the jurors, and at the end of the day, they're only human and everyone is imperfect. So, someone's life is in the hands of an imperfect man. And potential prosecutorial corruption. Well, no, that couldn't possibly happen in Florida. Jeez. And then it goes into some referencing of Sir Thomas More in the UK, political martyrs, the moral rot, the Eighth Amendment, Florida bar, and the way they treat the defense and the prosecution, the power imbalance, the systemic problems, the effects on families and friends, and that's just one book. Just one. And that's only like, I started doing the bookmarks like 2/3 of the way through, because I realised I could do that. So, yeah, I think we're going to just have way too much content. I'd like to give it, the time that it actually deserves, and do it justice. Then skimp. Don't like skimping. No. All right. Yes, you can, Christine. All right. Let's do it.
The Supreme Court of the United States held that a unanimous jury is required to impose the death penalty. In Hurst v. Florida, U.S. Supreme Court 2016, the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 ruling, applied the rule of Ring to Florida's previous capital sentencing scheme, striking it down and holding that the Sixth Amendment requires a jury to find the aggravating factors necessary for imposing the death penalty. After Hurst, the Florida legislature passed a new law requiring unanimity. Despite this, in 2023, they readdressed the issue again, lowering the threshold for death penalty imposition to a non-unanimous verdict. Second, the Florida legislature pushed through a death penalty for the non-homicide offense of capital child sexual battery. This also is in contradiction of current death penalty jurisprudence. In Coker v. Georgia, U.S. Supreme Court 1977, the Supreme Court of the United States held that the death penalty for rape of an adult woman was grossly disproportionate and excessive punishment, and therefore unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution. A few states continue to have child rape statutes that authorize the death penalty. In Kennedy v. Louisiana, U.S. Supreme Court 2008, the court expanded Coker, ruling that the death penalty is unconstitutional in all cases that do not involve homicide or crimes against the state. The governor is playing a political game, calculating that the support for the death penalty will propel him to further political heights. As a citizen, however, we need to debate the issue fairly and conscientiously for our own soul's sake. Politicians serve the electorate. The death penalty is not a partisan issue. Democrat Bill Clinton, when governor of Arkansas and a potential candidate for president, signed the death warrant for Ricky Ray Rector. The execution was marked by a man who was so mentally damaged that he asked for his last meal to be saved for later. Jared Muskowitz, a Democrat who served in the Florida House during the Parkland shooting, while running for Congress, tweeted, quote, "He should die. Even death is not enough. This is a travesty of justice," end quote. Governor Ron DeSantis took a firm stand for the increased imposition of the death penalty and for reducing barriers to its imposition. In reference to the Parkland high school shooter receiving a life sentence, DeSantis said, quote, "I just don't think anything else is appropriate, except the capital sentence in this case. And so I was very disappointed to see that," end quote. When DeSantis was seeking re-election in November, his Democratic opponent, Charlie Crist, echoed the governor's sentiment. Quote, "There are crimes for which the only just penalty is death. The Parkland families and community deserved that degree of justice," end quote, Crist said in a written statement. The death penalty is a very difficult subject. These cases are the most complex cases in criminal law. This book is by no means an attempt to summarize the existing state of law when it comes to the death penalty. That will be the subject for a future tome. This book instead attempts to lay out the question and the means for resolving it in an even-handed way for you, the faithful reader. I believe that my perspective here is a bit unique. I'm a Florida criminal trial law specialist. I have attended training for death penalty trial practice on both the prosecution side and on the defense side. I am trained in death penalty jury selection and am qualified to handle death penalty appeals in Florida. If my emphasis in this book is Florida, this is out of experience. Florida does currently seem like ground zero for the death penalty. So much of our dialogue is polarized, with each side being armed with a slogan and an example, seeking to bludgeon the other into submission. This is not how we should approach such a serious topic. Instead, I suggest that we approach the issue with rationality, balance, and humility. This book is a work in progress. I have attempted to present both sides as fairly and comprehensively as possible.
And he has.
If you have an additional argument that is not fairly presented herein, please send me your comments at stevegosney.com, and I will consider incorporating them into the structure of the book in future editions.
He would.
Chapter 1. What are we talking about? Mr. Joseph Rudolph Wood III and his 29-year-old ex-girlfriend, Debbie Dietz, had been involved in a turbulent relationship for 5 years, which had been marred by numerous breakups and several domestic violence incidents. Miss Dietz tried to end the relationship and got an order of protection against Mr. Wood. Deborah Dietz and her father, Eugene Dietz, drove together to work at their family auto body shop early on Monday morning, August 7th, 1989. Mr. Wood phoned the shop 3 times that morning. Deborah hung up on him once, and Eugene hung up on him twice. Wood called again and asked another employee if Deborah and Eugene were at the shop. The employee said that they had temporarily left, but would soon return. Deborah and Eugene came back at 8:30 a.m. and began working in different areas of the shop. 6 other employees were also present that morning. At 8:50 a.m., a Tucson police officer saw Mr. Wood driving in a suspicious manner near the shop. The officer slowed her patrol car and made eye contact with Mr. Wood as he left his truck and entered the shop. Eugene was on the telephone in an area where 3 other employees were working. Mr. Wood waited for Eugene to hang up, drew a revolver, and approached within 4 feet of him. The other employees shouted for Mr. Wood to put the gun away. Without saying a word, Wood fatally shot Eugene once in the chest and then smiled. Deborah had apparently heard an employee shout that her father had been shot and was trying to telephone for help when Wood grabbed her around the neck from behind and placed his revolver directly against her chest. Deborah struggled and screamed, "No, Joe, don't." Another employee heard Wood say, "I told you I was going to do it. I have to kill you." Mr. Wood then called Deborah a bitch and shot her twice in the chest. Mr. Wood was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death for each murder. 25 years after the murders, on July 23rd, 2014, Mr. Wood was executed by lethal injection. The execution began at 1:52 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Joseph Rudolph Wood III was strapped to a gurney in an orange jumpsuit by prison employees. Prison medical staff prepared to set intravenous lines in his arms. It was 1:30 in the afternoon at Housing Unit 9, the small 1-story freestanding stucco building where executions are carried out at the Arizona Prison Complex, Florence. In the death chamber, Wood's eyes flitted back and forth, and his eyebrows arched as men in scrubs, their faces out of camera range, fussed with blood pressure cuffs and trays of IV needles. The lines went in easily. Maybe he was smiling, but just slightly. He took a few gulps of air and closed his eyes. 4 minutes into the procedure, the doctor appeared on the other side of the window. He checked Wood's eyes and pulse, and then said over the microphone, "It is confirmed that he is sedated." At about 2:05, Wood began gasping. Wood's mouth opened. 3 minutes later, it opened again, and his chest moved as if he had burped. Then 2 minutes again and again. The mouth opened wider and wider. Then it didn't stop. He gulped like a fish on land. The movement was like a piston. The mouth opened, the chest rose, the stomach convulsed. The sound Wood was making was a snoring, sucking sound, similar to when a swimming pool filter starts taking in air. It was a louder noise than a person can imitate. It was death by apnea. And this scene went on for an hour and a half. Wood's mouth opened more than 640 times. When the executioners had been told that 1 dose would be lethal, they actually had to re-administer the killing dose 15 times. As Wood was drowning in the air, 2 of his attorneys left the room. Wood's lawyers filed an emergency appeal with the Supreme Court an hour into the procedure, requesting that the prolonged execution be halted. In the motion, they wrote, "He has been gasping and snorting for more than an hour. He is still alive." Finally, Wood started to gasp less frequently. Once, twice, minutes apart. He stopped at 3:36. At 3:40 and 3:48, the doctor examined him and pronounced him still sedated. This is the death penalty.
Yep. That's the reality.
Chapter 2. What is the question. The question of the death penalty is often posed as, do you support the death penalty? A knee-jerk reaction from whatever side will soon be forthcoming. That Parkland shooter guy should be killed. Or from the other side, the death penalty is just so dirty, followed by examples of innocents who have been placed on death row. The problem is, the debate goes no further, with each side emotionally secure in their position, and any deeper discussion paved over by sloganeering and moral preening. I would suggest that not only is the debate not well educated, it is asking the wrong question entirely. Many people think they are being asked if they could vote for the death penalty if they were on a jury. Or perhaps they feel they are answering whether the death penalty is appropriate in certain extreme examples. But this question is not the one that needs answering for you as a free citizen. The real question is not about you. The individual citizen, unless actually on a death penalty jury, will not be asked to personally impose the death penalty. It is not your decision. The decision is instead delegated to a representative sample of impartial citizen jurors who listen to all the evidence and cast their votes in a court of law.
Steve actually qualified in capital punishment jury selection as well. You should see the man's CV.
The question for the citizen is better restated as follows. Is the death penalty a net positive or a net negative for society? To answer this, the proper question, you need to understand the issues involved. Once you understand all sides of the question, both the positives and the negatives, you will then be in a position to put them in the scale and weigh them against each other. After this exercise, you may ask, do the positives outweigh the negatives? Or do the negatives outweigh the positives? Having a death penalty involves trade-offs. Such an exploration into the pros and cons for a society is better for clarifying the question. This book attempts to fairly present each argument, either pro or con, in the strongest way possible. The reader is left to the challenge of deciding how much weight to give each argument. For myself, I give tremendous weight to the Catholic position on the death penalty. To the non-Christian, this may have very little weight. At the end of the book, I would ask you to fairly weigh each of the arguments and come to your own conclusion. The issue also must be framed with the alternative punishment that is set against a death penalty, that of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There are some, including many inmates, that feel that a life sentence is worse than a death sentence.
Yeah.
This is a
That's
very
exactly what happened with that pro se defendant that I streamed a couple of days ago. That his main argument was he was begging for them to impose the death penalty because he knew that he would be serving, at least 10 to 15 years before the process actually got to that point. He was in his 60s as it was, and if he's on death row, he gets a nice private cell with a TV. Doesn't have to share his bunk. That was his argument. I shit you not.
Objective and individualized question. Regardless, this is the real contest in the capital sentencing phase of trial. The only question the jury is being asked is whether the convicted person gets life in prison or the death penalty. For a defense attorney in the capital practice, a sentence of life in prison without parole is a win. So onwards, is the death penalty a net positive for society or a net negative?
Let's find out, shall we?
Chapter 3. Distinctions between other forms of homicide and death. With any discussion of the death penalty, we need to be clear in our terminology. Homicide is not necessarily murder.
So basically, the death penalty can be imposed on a first-degree murder charge in the state if they are pro-death penalty. The issue is in determining the differences between each first-degree murder charge. Those factors that determine the differences between a life without parole sentence or a death penalty sentence is where the issue lies. Because if they're called aggregating factors, if you have too many of those factors that you need to meet the criteria to impose the death penalty, it becomes arbitrary and then unconstitutional. So there needs to be something like, oh, who's that? Oh, hello. Hang on, I have to create a spot for you. Hang on. And a camera slot. Oh, there she is. Let me move me. Roop. How are you, sweet cheeks?
Hello, darling. How are you?
Good. Are you going rogue? Or have you changed your studio?
This is my bedroom.
Oh. Ooh, we're in bed with Miss Monday.
Ooh,
Oh, lucky we.
I better super chat for that mess now.
Last time I took everyone to my room, they heard me snore. Did you see that stream? I actually had an hour of me snoring.
I didn't see the stream, but I wish I would have.
I've done a clip of it. I'll send it to you. It's
On the
hysterical.
stream, just let me know and I will. Hey, Chloe came in. Hey, Chloe.
She did, yes, she did, and thank you for sending her over. That's awesome.
She's sweet.
How are you, sweet cheeks?
She's really sweet. She's evil. No, I'm just kidding. She's very sweet.
She'll fit right in, won't she? And how are you?
Doing good. I got kind of a throat thing going on, but other than that, I'm doing good. Did you have a nice Christmas?
Yes, I did. I went up and spent it with my mum, which was nice. Haven't done that in ages.
Nice.
Yeah.
I went
nothing
and seen my
special, but-
mom too.
Is she far from you?
4 hours. Yeah,
And in the car or?
she's in car. She's in a nursing home, so I went and seen her for the day. It was nice, very nice.
It's a long drive for a day trip.
But work, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was nice
You need
to
a
see
mobile
her.
streaming kit.
It was so nice to see her.
The only issue I had up there was that my mum is in like the Bermuda Triangle vortex of signal. I only had one bar on my mobile phone. I couldn't check my emails. I couldn't do anything. Then I went and bought her a modem. And then that didn't really pick up much. So then I bought her a booster. And even then, I couldn't get on. I was trying to log her into my Netflix, but I couldn't get on the internet to change my subscription at the same time as I was streaming on it on her telly. It was just ridiculous. Ridiculous. I'll never complain about my cable ever again.
But she doesn't know how to use Bluetooth.
Yeah.
But she wanted headphones, so I found headphones that would plug into her iPad that were
Yep.
just, whenever her ears. And I took them to her and showed her, how to just plug them in, and she was so excited. The next day, she calls me and she's like, I can't get my headphones to work. I was like, Mom, you are the only person I know that can't get headphones that literally just plug into a hole to work. And you know what she was doing wrong? She didn't have the volume turned up on her iPad.
My mum just had got a pair of earphones as well because she is profoundly deaf, and I set it all up. It was Bluetooth to her phone because she sits there watching YouTube, and the volume is so goddamn high, it's ridiculous. She can't even speak. So I Bluetooth them together, showed her how to use it. It was easy. And she left them on the dressing table in my bedroom. So she must have woken up during the night and decided she wanted to watch YouTube. And all I could hear is this noise somewhere in my room. And I didn't know where it was coming from. And the next morning she goes, oh, something's wrong with my phone. I can't get the volume to
The only thing my mom knows how to watch on YouTube is me, because I have it saved to her favorites. And I spent 4 hours showing her the different things that she could watch on YouTube. And she was like, you mean I can listen to music and I can watch clips of Friends and I can watch clips of this and that? And I was like,
you can
yes.
watch how to pick your nose if you want to.
I told her type in free movies, and she typed in free movies, and all these free movies come up. She, oh my gosh, I can watch the whole Twilight series. I was like, yeah, I guess. Go for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The whole next day, she watched the whole Twilight series.
Did you get
There
my
that day.
email?
I got the email with the StreamYard link.
You haven't heard any the last few days?
Oh, the interview?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, cool.
No, that's really awesome.
Pardon?
That's awesome.
Yeah, so just let me know, and
Okay.
I will. I'll sort it.
Okay. I'll let you know.
I'm playing
off stream.
Skip. And I've made some new friends too.
Hi.
Hey?
Yeah, like accidentally, I made friends with this congresswoman that was fired by Biden within the last week. And she was like, I was trying to get a hold of her daughter, who was a treasurer, to come on Jason's show. And she answered the phone and told me her name. And I Googled her name real quick. And she was a congresswoman.
Oh.
And I was like, would you like to come on? She was like, sure. I just got fired last week. I'll come on and tell you whatever you want to know. I was like, okay, let's book you right now.
Yeah. Well,
So
one of the
but
newbies that came on a few days ago is really good friends with Ian Runkle. So yeah. Your audio is dropping in and out.
oh, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Runkle and Bailey.
Yeah, Runkle's a baby.
Oh yeah, I love Runkle. Yeah.
Yeah, he's awesome. So yeah.
He used to work for Arby's Corporate Fiction, so he and I are friends. I could get him on if you wanted to.
I was actually trying to think of what I could invent for him to discuss, because he's right into guns and gun safety and
sovereign citizens too.
Pardon?
He's really into sovereign citizens too.
Ah, okay. I'll put my thinking cap on. I actually, while I was getting ready for this stream, had a brilliant idea. Brilliant. That I should put to YouTube. I reckon we should, as creators, have an award ceremony on grifting, and have it in different categories. So you got the funniest grift, the stupidest grift, the most creative grift. You know what I mean? Like, not only are we promoting content creators, but we're creating content as well.
That is so funny. That's a good idea. Yeah. That's a great idea.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we can all unite. And it gives us something to do.
So I come up with a new idea for my channel. Can I run it by you?
Yeah.
Okay. So you know how I do like police body cam videos and stuff?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I thought about, and I think I messaged you about it, having people come on that were on the body cam videos and watch the videos on my channel for the first time and react to them.
It? How the hell do you find them?
They give their full names on the videos. All I have to do is look them up on social media.
Oh.
I've already looked up 2 people and talked to them, and one of them's willing to come on. They've never seen the video. I said, well, don't watch it. I'll show it to you on my channel. And she was like, okay, that's fine. And she got arrested for stealing at Walgreens. And she was stealing food in order to live. And like Walgreens was vicious. Like they could have just like kicked her out and like had her trespassed. But they prosecuted her. Then they come to court and ask for the highest possible bail, and then they asked you first they asked you didn't get a bail, no bond. They wanted no bond, which that's for murderers. Okay, shut up.
Yeah.
And then they were like, that they thought she was running an elaborate scheme, stealing from all Walgreens. She had never even had a traffic ticket before.
Mm-hmm.
And the judge jumped their asses about it and was like, no, she's in
What
her
state is this?
60s and she's never even been arrested.
Oh, she was in her 60s. Pack of arseholes. Where was it?
Cream corn and green beans and things like it was so sad. It really was.
So it wasn't even like she was buying, expensive stuff to flog to someone else.
But I don't see anybody else doing that, bringing people on to react to their content. So I thought maybe give it a try.
I was actually thinking, I put it in a poll today. Do I or do I not? Because I haven't had a drink for probably, well, I had a sip of Bailey's before Christmas, but on a stream, but that was it. But yeah, I don't drink as a general rule, and I haven't done so for about 10 years. Do I or do I not have a New Year's Eve griftathon? Let's get Jodie tipsy, Christine.
Hey, if you do it, I'll do it with you. If you do it, I'll do it with you. How about that? Two people that haven't drank in a long time, and we'll do it together.
For every what, $10, $20 super chats, we have to take a shot or something. I don't know.
It's been like 2 years ago, but 2 years ago on Christmas, I did that, and I said $10, and I'll take a little shot. $20, I'll take a double shot. I made $300 that night.
Really?
I was so drunk I couldn't get out of the seat after I ended the stream. I ended the stream and I went back and slept there for an hour, and then I got up and went to bed.
I've got Bailey's and I've got butterscotch schnapps, so the cocksucking cowboy cap. I can make plenty of shots of that.
That sounds good.
Yes, but I figured I wake up in agony and feeling like a piece of shit every goddamn morning. I may as well have a bit of fun before.
Have a reason to feel that way in the morning.
And drunk Jodie is fucking hilarious.
So are you going to do it like Australia time or American time?
No, I think it'll have to be American time. So we'll have to start at like...
Yeah, it does.
Start at like what? Lunchtime, my time on Thursday. Is that right? Because I'm 14 hours ahead. So New Year's here is tomorrow. Like this time tomorrow, it'll be over for me. So it's 14 hours later. So yeah, I think it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I think. So it'll be afternoon sesh for me.
Eastern time?
I'm 14 hours ahead of Eastern Standard Time. Hang on, let me check on my world clock. Let me take a look. I had to download this because I'm so confused, especially when you're trying to coordinate with people in Sweden and America and Australia and daylight savings.
Yeah.
World clock. All right, so it's 1:36 here, yeah. So it's 9:30 in the morning over there, yeah?
Yeah.
9:37.
Yeah.
In the morning. So you add 12 hours to that, that's 9:30 at night.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it has to be 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Here.
Isn't that starting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
Yeah, I'd be starting my stream at 2 o'clock Thursday. And it would be then
Sure.
10
Okay.
10 a.m. Shit. No, 10 p.m. your time.
Okay, that sounds good. I think you want to start 2 p.m. my time. It's like, girl, you won't make it.
Actually, if I
won't
started
make
at, I might start at 3 p.m. and that gives us an hour before midnight. An hour is enough, yeah? I don't know.
I think 10 would be better.
All right.
Well, that's just my opinion.
So it'll be an afternoon sesh for me.
Hey, Christine, how you doing, hon? She comes to all my streams. She's so sweet.
She does, yes. She's having a birthday stream on the 17th
Yeah, I'm
on
gonna
her channel. Pardon?
I'm gonna help her out with it.
You got the invitation?
I have not, but I got an email. I got an email.
Yeah. Yep. I can't do it 2 in a row, so that means, do I do a stream tomorrow? No, I don't do a stream tomorrow then. I'll wait until the I did have to laugh though, because there is, no trials and stuff. The stuff that true crime creators are coming up with. Like, I watched Nick Starrow do a tour of his backyard today.
There ain't shit going on right now. Nothing.
This is a bush. This is a flower. This is a tree.
Well, the guy that killed the CEO goes to court Monday or Friday. Goes to court Friday for
Was
his
there a hearing?
first appearance. So that
What's his
would
name?
Luigi.
Yeah, that's it. Mangiano or something.
Yeah, something like that. But
Yeah.
that'll be big Jews.
Yeah, but it's not going to go to court for ages.
Yeah, that's just the first appearance.
Yeah. Yes,
So
she
you
did,
would-
Christine. Yes, she did. We were just talking about that.
I did get wrong. Yes, ma'am. I responded to it.
Pardon?
I was saying I responded to it. I'm sorry, these headphones suck.
Yeah, you sort of fade in and out.
Let me change my headphones and I'll jump back on, okay?
Okay.
All right.
I don't know how you wear those pods. They're really annoying. I just can't keep them in. That's what she said. Yeah. Well, if I did the New Year's Eve stream, then I won't stream tomorrow morning. It'll be tomorrow night instead. I think that's a fair trade-off for a hangover. Unless you all got something better to do, because I ain't. Oh, my hair. It's driving me mental. I feel like a washerwoman. Now, where is everybody? Where's Lizzie? Anita Hef. They've all racked off. Yes, I know. That's pretty much one of the reasons why I stopped drinking. Yeah, because for me, it's either all or nothing. There is no in between. It's go hard or go home. So yeah, yep. And I suffer with hangovers bad, but meh. I already wake up in pain. So, what were you drinking, Tricia? I used to drink a lot of red wine. Used to like my red wine. But I don't mind a nice Bailey's on the rocks though. Especially if I can't sleep. Does the trick. Medicinal, of course. All right, do we start? I'll start this back up and we can stop it when she comes back up. Oh, both not mixed together, surely. No? Oh, I can't even cope with brandy. Oh, oh dear. Oh dear. That was nasty. Oh, Lord, Teresa. That would have been nasty. I feel for you. I do. All right. Let's play.
All murders are
I'm going to eat
homicides,
my
but not
snacks.
all homicides are murders. The killing of one person by another
This is
may be
interesting.
legal and may even be moral. A killing in furtherance of self-defense is not murder. The existence of police shootings or self-defense killings are not connected to the existence of the death penalty. Conflating the two is improper. I think that needs to be explained more fully. While police shootings are state-sanctioned killings, where the police officer acts as judge and jury, the police use of force to stop someone is a protective force. Deadly force can be used by the state through its law enforcement arm to stop a person from harming the police officer or others. In those moments, the state killing isn't about punishment, vengeance, retribution, justice, or any other rationale for the death penalty. Instead, a police shooting is about life preservation. This is not to say that a police officer cannot commit murder, only that justified police shootings are not equivalent to a death penalty administered by the state after trial. Similarly, there is a distinction between individual justified use of deadly, defensive force by individuals and murder. The United States has generally upheld a vigorous right of individual self-defense, including deadly force. Deadly force used at the time of a violent act may be entirely justified at that time, but once the criminal is subdued, the use of deadly force is disallowed. Thus, it would be murder to shoot a handcuffed person in the back of a van, when 10 minutes earlier, that person was whacking at someone with a machete. A shooting would have been entirely legal and even desirable. I would, of course, defer to my friend Andrew Branca and his excellent law of self-defense organization to develop the law behind the individual use of deadly force. Like the police officer example above, the use of deadly force by individuals is strictly governed by law and is not grounded in the same.
There she is. Welcome back.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Is that better?
Yeah.
Very good.
Yes, it is much better.
Oh, I can hear you better too.
What were
That's
they?
expensive. AirPods, yeah. I'm gonna sell them things, man.
Yeah, I don't like them.
Well, like I have all the AirPods, but those are the new ones and they stink.
Oh,
Yeah.
it was like the very start and the very end of everything you said faded off.
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. Just giving you feedback.
Okay. Yeah. That's what everybody tells me about those.
Stupid.
I'm
Are
gonna
they
highlight
like
a
the
comment.
genuine ones?
They were the new ones, the new AirPod 4s. They're still under warranty. I might get my money back.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna highlight a comment. Teresa,
Yeah. And put it
vodka is
together.
my drink of choice. Yeah.
Have you seen? We've got a new one out here, and it's a vodka base, but it's called a fruit tingle, and it tastes.
Sounds wonderful.
Oh, it tastes just like drinking fruit tingles. Apparently,
I don't
bought
know
them
what
for
a fruit tingle
Christmas,
is.
and my girls drank them. And I loved them. It's like a little spritz can, pre-mixed. Maybe I'll get. What's in a fireball? I hear a lot about these.
Oh,
and
they're
I don't.
gross, honey. Oh God. You know the little fireball candies, or do you not?
No.
Okay, it's really, really heavy cinnamon.
Oh God, look.
Yeah,
You've lost me already.
like candy cinnamon, not like
Cinnamon
real
whiskey.
cinnamon. Like candy cinnamon, not like real cinnamon.
Is it mixed with anything else?
Straight cheap whiskey.
Why? You set it on fire or something?
No.
Oh.
They call it fireball because it's got so much cinnamon schnapps in it that it sets your mouth on fire.
Oh.
Yeah.
And do you drink it like a shot or do you sip on it?
No, you take it like a shot.
I think love it.
Gross.
Alicia loves
Oh,
it.
love it. Yum. Yeah, cinnamon whiskey. Exactly.
No, thank you. Two of my least favourite things.
Yeah, my best friend loves them, and she was like, "Here, take one." I was like, "I've never had one before." She's like, "You'll love it." It set my mouth on freaking fire. I was like, "What? There's something wrong with you, girl." I was like, "You don't have
Mhm.
taste buds or feeling in your mouth or something."
No, she's had too many fireballs, that's why.
Something. I was like, "I like fruity stuff. I don't like this
Yeah,
crap. Sets my
yeah.
mouth on fire. I'm not down for that."
Have you ever had a cocksucking cowboy? It's the butterscotch schnapps, half
No,
butterscotch,
I prefer
half
mine
Baileys.
that like girls.
I know you didn't. Tanya and I have Tanya's a bit partial to the cocksucking cowboy.
What's
Actually,
in it?
maybe it's just half butterscotch schnapps and half Bailey's Irish cream. That's
I
it.
love any kind of butterscotch liqueur. I
Yeah,
love butterscotch.
yeah.
Like my favorite flavor besides vanilla, probably.
I should see if Tanya can come and join me.
Yeah,
It's already after our New Year's Eve. It's an afternoon thing.
there you go.
Yeah. She's doing oh, you love Bailey's and hate butterscotch. You can mix it with Bailey's. I think they do what's it called? A Black Russian? Is it vodka and Bailey's?
Yeah. You can do Bailey's Irish cream and uh,
Kahlua?
Kahlua, and that is an amazing drink.
Yeah.
We do it all the time here. Or you can mix it with a vanilla liqueur, and you want to talk about, we call it a snowball drop, and it is
Oh.
so good. Oh my gosh, it's so good. Snowball drop is so good. Oh,
A snowball drop. I was talking to Unahef. Shit, I didn't get back on Discord. This morning, and he was saying he was writing a song called a snowball drop for his
really?
for his channel.
Is it about drinking?
He didn't say.
Oh,
So Tanya has started up her own channel, and so is Unahef. He's doing music, like writing
hmm,
songs, and he's very talented on the banjo and the guitar.
very cool.
And Tan is doing true crime as well. So, excuse me. We're currently doing the prep for the Azaria Chamberlain. You know, Lindy Chamberlain, the Dingo Got My Baby.
Yeah,
Yep. So we're gonna cover that together as her debut
very
next week.
cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to send you something on Discord real quick.
I'm sure
I'll be right
I'm
back.
probably been really rude and hadn't even. I'm sure Udahef's probably sent me messages and I haven't been back on. I'm hopeless. I can't manage it all. I can't do Discord and bloody YouTube and Facebook and Insta and X and he's got 7 messages. Sorry, Udahef. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Where do you live again? I don't know the country well, but I know you got like a desert part and a rainforest part and a coral reef part. Which part am I in? There's the 3 parts of Australia that we Americans are aware of. You missed out the inbred part, which is Tassie. Oh, that's gold. There is could you imagine me summing up America in the same way? Oh dear. Where'd Mandy go? No more vodka for me, not even. Oh, yeah. What did I get? very, very first time I got drunk was on an island cooler. Like, it was a premix back in the 80s. And yeah, I could never. I spewed that so much, I could never go back and have another one. Oops. I don't know where Mandy's gone, but we need to get this.
Rationale as criminal penalties. There is also a distinction between government war-making powers and murder. Innocent people die in war, and that is the consequence of government action. However, like police shootings above, the war-making power is not invoked when an execution occurs. The power of the state to wage war is, theoretically, in furtherance of defending the nation and promoting the national interest. But this is unconnected with the imposition of the death penalty. Chapter 4. Framework for answering the question. Systematic approach. The death penalty is a system. A look at the death penalty requires that the reader understand that the death penalty is part of an overall process that involves charging, discovery, trial, sentencing, incarceration, appeals, and execution. Pro-death penalty folks generally focus on the crime itself, while anti-death penalty folks focus on the defendant, what caused the crime, and the larger picture. In considering the question posed, all these sides must be fairly taken into account. The examples that one side makes can always be countered by other examples on the other end. The question by proponents of the death penalty is whether someone deserves to die for a crime. The logical rebuttal to that question is whether we deserve the right to kill. Ultimately, both sides need to reconcile themselves to the negative examples. This means that proponents of the death penalty must accept that innocent people will be executed in any system. Likewise, opponents of the death penalty must be reconciled to the extreme cases wherein the death penalty will not be imposed. The intro story about Mr. Wood's murder of Miss Dietz and her father, Mr. Dietz, illustrates the two sides of the death penalty. The anti-death penalty folks should understand that they are supporting life in prison as punishment for some very bad acts. The pro-death penalty folks should understand the reality of what is being done during a death sentence. This systematic approach requires us to look outside of the perpetrator and the victim. Regardless of whether the punishment is life in prison or death, the sentence will affect people related to the perpetrator. Therefore, the question becomes whether the collateral effects on innocent family members should be considered. If the offender is viewed as an isolated individual, then collateral effects on family members should not be considered. But this argument also runs two ways. We either do or we do not take the collateral impacts of innocent family members into account. If the effects on innocent individual family members on the side of the victim's family are heard, is it not also fair and proper to take the effect on the killer's family into account? In a system that allows for victim impact statements, the impact of the sentence on a killer's parents, spouse, and children should also be given weight. The systematic nature of criminal justice can be a hard pill to swallow for some. The fact is that there is actually an optimal amount of crime within society to which additional criminal sanction will make the society marginally worse. This is hard for people to accept, since it seems that we are tolerating evil. To think otherwise is to live in a utopian ideal. Man is flawed, and crime will occur. The requirement that due process be given to all is powerfully illustrated in Robert Bolt's play A Man for All Seasons. In that play, the character of Sir Thomas More is confronted with a young ideologue who desires to destroy evil with the human power at his hands, even if that means disregarding process. Sir Thomas More muses, quote, "What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil? And when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, Roper? The law is all being flat. This country is planted thick with laws, from coast to coast, man's laws, not God's. And if you cut them down, and you're just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Yes, I give the devil benefit of law for my own safety's sake." End quote. As part of the system, I have personally witnessed the mob in action that rails against the defense attorney every time they make an objection or voice a point in favor of the accused. First, it is impossible to express two thoughts at the same time. No matter how careful a defense attorney is, the emotional effect of making positive statements about an accused murderer strikes the ears of the murder victim's family as justification for the act. Second, as discussed earlier, we have an adversarial system that places the role of advocacy for the accused on the part of the defense attorney. The adversarial system provides a place for the crimes to be presented, a time for aggravators, and a time for mitigators. I was recently part of a defense team that had to present mitigation in a high-profile, emotionally charged murder case. The lead attorney struck a very composed, soft-spoken, and compassionate tone. She gave the deepest sympathies to the murder victim's family and never placed an ounce of blame on that victim. She sought only to lay out the mitigators that suggested the inappropriateness of the harshest sentence for her client. The prosecution team were as emotionally charged up as the victim's family, and I suspect poured their own sort of gasoline on the fire of emotions swirling around that courtroom. After the judge handed down the harshest sentence he could, and in this case life in prison, the family and the prosecutor took to the courthouse steps to personally condemn the defense team. Folks, this is our adversarial criminal justice system. Punishment. In Florida, punishment for a crime is a primary purpose of criminal sanction. Punishment implies that a lesson would be learned. If execution occurs, obviously there will be no learning on the part of the executed person. The punishment may be meant as a lesson to others. Interestingly, sending a message arguments by prosecutors are not allowed in closing arguments. The punishment argument then must be wrapped up into the deterrent arguments. Deterrence must work in order for punishment to be a valid reason to impose the death penalty. Many advocates for the death penalty, based on a personal responsibility view, see the death penalty as inflicted only on an individual. Therefore, to them, the consequences of how a death sentence affects the people related to the murderer is irrelevant to the equation. Constitutionality. Many death penalty supporters cite as support for the death penalty the fact that it is constitutional. This is not an argument in support. Just because someone believes that the government should not have on its list of penalties the penalty of death, this does not necessarily mean that the person believes the death penalty is unconstitutional. Those are two different questions. Capital punishment could be constitutional and a net societal negative. Capital punishment could be unconstitutional and a net social positive. However, if it is unconstitutional, then that is the end of the debate. No death penalty is available. Likewise, if the death penalty is a net policy negative, that also should be the end of the debate. There should be no death penalty. But it is up to the legislative branch to eliminate it. It is only when it is both constitutional and it is a net policy positive should it be considered.
Good morning,
Anti-death penalty
Elizabeth.
advocates often make this argument in reverse.
How are
In their
we?
desire to end the death penalty, they project onto the Constitution, usually the cruel and unusual punishments clause, a finding of unconstitutionality. This is really a debate between constitutional originalists and progressives. The originalists note that the death penalty was sanctioned in the early United States. Thus, the founding fathers must have created a constitution that sanctioned, or at least did not disallow, capital punishment. Progressives, meanwhile, seek to expand the Constitution into the present day and the future towards a more utopian future. This debate is beyond the scope of this book. Let us resolve that if the death penalty is unconstitutional, then that is the end of the debate. If the death penalty is constitutional, then we must discuss the issue for ourselves as this book intends. Increased process and wrongful conviction. Many pro-death penalty supporters point to the protections involved in the death penalty trial as protection against wrongful conviction. However, the pro-death penalty states are also the least protective of the rights of the accused. For example, in Florida, we have whittled away at
darling.
the circumstantial evidence rule. The whittling
Australia abolished the death penalty in 85, I think it was. I was actually going through this the other day with 10. I need new glasses bad. Okay. I know I wrote it somewhere. The longest time spent on death row is 46 years. The average wait is 10 to 15. The shortest time on death row is 252 days. And the country that apparently has executed the most criminals is China. I know I wrote it here somewhere. I'm pretty sure it was 85. No, can't find it. In amongst my scribble. Anyway, because I know I wrote it on purpose. Dagnammit. No. Sorry, love. No death penalty in Australia. But I like how he separates each of the issues into a separate chapter and explains them clearly as well. I'm actually looking, because we're listening to an audiobook, I am I'm looking for things that I can actually put up on the screen without sound, just to entertain you to watch. And I don't, I've got all these screen recordings from bits and pieces and I have no idea what they are. So if I mute that and just play random screen recordings, that could be quite funny. That's what I'm playing at the moment. I don't know if I can do both, but yeah, we'll give it a go.
Way of protections can be partially traced to the tendency of those who favor a death penalty to blame the justice system for its slow administration. Their solution to this problem is often to limit access to appeals and post-conviction relief. In 2023, the state of Florida passed 2 pro-death penalty laws aimed at executing more people. Notably, no additional funding was allocated for this endeavor. Thus, the solution to the death penalty barriers is to starve the defense of funding or to limit access to appeals to those convicted of death. Here, in our part of Florida, our Capital Division Chief, Nancy Ryan, walked a man off of death row.
So now that I've done that, can you still hear the story or not? Or did I just completely stuff the story? You couldn't hear the story? All right. Bye-bye. Sorry, Ty. Oh. Stupid. I feel like I'm down in the bottom here. Cat hasn't even come back. Little turd. All right. So, to play.
No other evidence. We also need to dispense with weak or unserious arguments. Slippery slope. There is a pro-death penalty argument that if there is no death penalty, then a state will devolve into a pro-criminal state, with the oft-used example of California. However, many states do not have the death penalty, and they do not devolve into a pro-criminal state. The removal of the death penalty from the list of approved state penalties is not a green light to crime. Most states do not have a death penalty, but...
Can you hear it now?
their crime is much lower.
Can you hear that?
In fact, the states with the death penalty
cool.
have the highest homicide rate.
It scared me.
We must be cognizant to not confuse correlation and causation. On balance, it must also be acknowledged that the removal of the death penalty from the list of state-sanctioned penalties will not result in a solution to the larger problem of unjust sentencing. Injustices will still occur. Nirvana will not have been achieved with or without the death penalty. Anti-death penalty folks will counter that the civilizing effect will marginally improve the system. Just how much improvement will be made is the quantitative question. Compare, there are approximately 300 inmates on Florida's death row. In contrast, there are approximately 13,600 inmates serving a life sentence in Florida. More broadly, there are approximately 2,500 inmates on death row in the United States, including 690 from California, where there is a de facto moratorium on executions. There are approximately 200,000 inmates serving a life sentence in the United States. Assume that all of those persons with a death sentence were converted to life sentences. Florida will go from 13,600 to 13,900 serving life sentences. The United States will go from 200,000 inmates to 202,500 inmates serving life sentences. If the death penalty went away tomorrow, the world would still be imperfect and problems within the criminal justice system would remain. Emotion. A thought about morality and objectivity. Should emotions govern or be a factor in law? If so, then we have a battle of feelings, and many of the rational arguments contained herein are irrelevant to your own analysis. Emotions are not a basis for legal analysis. For example, in Florida, the rules for deliberation set out in Standard Criminal Jury Instructions 3.10 sub 3 and sub 8 state clearly, this case must not be decided for or against anyone because you feel sorry for anyone or are angry at anyone. And further, your verdict should not be influenced by feelings of prejudice, bias, or sympathy. The case law is also clear. Appeals to sympathy and emotion are error. Law based on emotions cannot be sustained. We all feel loss. Anger at a wrongdoer is completely normal and justified. In no way do I seek to diminish the feelings or emotions of those who have suffered tremendous evil and loss at the hands of a murderer. The public policy question should be answered rationally, because to do otherwise undermines the rule of law. Moral preening. We each have the individual responsibility to act morally. It is immoral to translate our political conclusions into a sense of moral superiority over others. We need to be cognizant of our own alluring sense of moral superiority. This goes for proponents of either side. People stating that the government should have the death penalty stake a position as an advocate of justice for the victim and the victim's family. They hold up a horrific crime as an example, and in an emotionally enraged state declare that they disapprove of the murder such that anyone who advocates for less than death is somehow defending the murderous fact pattern. These death penalty advocates want to feel morally superior to anyone arguing for a lesser penalty. This is a primal, emotion-based part of human nature. Similarly, a person who does not want the death penalty may seek to elevate their moral position by finding a marginal case or one of innocence, and seek to derive a morally superior position in relation to advocates for the killing. These arguments can be more about the self-referential desire to feel morally superior to others than grounding a rational and coherent position.
Does that sound familiar?
This human tendency can be labeled virtue signaling. Do not be fooled. This tendency occurs on both sides of the debate. Beware of this innate human tendency in yourself before proceeding. Gaining a perceived morally superior position in relation to an opponent is an intoxicating drug. Ad hominem attacks. An offshoot of the appeal to emotion is the ad hominem attack. Those supporting the death penalty may characterize the sentence of life in prison without parole as a coward's death penalty.
Especially legal ones.
In both cases, the murderer comes out of the prison in a box. The only question is when. To this, one must ask, would a juror who votes for death be willing to carry it out themselves? The cowardice cuts both ways. Does the intervention of a state surrogate relieve the individual juror of moral responsibility for the death vote? Is the death penalty acceptable when done by others, but repulsive when they themselves would be required to carry out the execution? Would the person advocating for that position be willing to take a knife to death row and go down the cell rows, stabbing each person as they go? If they were able to do this, I would question that person.
You think?
Most people would rightfully wince if such an opportunity presented itself. Dr. Thomas Sowell makes an excellent counter to this argument in his 1980 book, Knowledge and Decisions. Dr. Sowell notes that most people would not want to witness, much less conduct, an abdominal operation, yet no one regards that as evidence of immorality of the operation. The point is that both sides need to take seriously the issue we are discussing. It is not a flippant thing. As Clint Eastwood in the movie Unforgiven coldly stated, "It's a hell of a thing killing a man. Take away all he's got and all he's ever going to have." Language can frame how we see a debate. For example, in the abortion debate, is the child in the womb a baby or a fetus? Are you pro-life or pro-choice? Similarly, the terminology used could be the choice between death in prison by other causes versus death in prison by state execution. Could it be rephrased as pro-death penalty or just pro-death, pro-vengeance, anti-life, or pro-execution? On the other side, do we use pro-life, pro-mercy, anti-death penalty, or some other variety? The words we use do not change the underlying reality of what is happening. We need to be sober and clear in what we are discussing and not confuse the issue with loaded terminology. For the purposes of this book, I will stick with pro-death penalty and anti-death penalty, just for consistency. Popular opinion. Another argument that cuts both ways is that because the death penalty is supported by a majority of the populace, it should be enforced. This, of course, could cut the other way. If the majority does not support the death penalty, would its advocates suddenly agree to its abolishment? No. The reason for this book is to raise the discourse to a more rational level. Popular opinion is an appeal to the mob. To demonstrate the problem with having major moral questions determined by majority rule, one could look to the doctrine of popular sovereignty as championed by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas in Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. He argued that the people of federal territories should decide for themselves whether they wanted to have slavery legal or illegal, rather than have Congress do so. Opposition to the doctrine of popular sovereignty provided the platform that catapulted Lincoln to national prominence and ultimately the presidency. Utopianism. When discussing the death penalty, we must be sure to deal with the actual world as it exists, rather than a fantasy world. This effect is most apparent when dealing with proponents of the death penalty to assert that their solution would cost way less. In this ideal world imagined by the proponents of the death penalty, the cost of life in prison is measured against the cost of a single bullet. This is so far from the reality of any death penalty system that could exist in a free state as to be considered not serious. Now, cost may or may not be an argument for the death penalty, but we need to be sure that we are dealing with the actual system rather than a fantasy one. Cost and deterrence. Both sides use deterrence and cost in support of their positions. As to cost, should it be a primary consideration at all? If the cost differentials were extraordinary, then cost may be a larger factor. If the differences in costs are de minimis, then other factors should be considered as much weightier. Would eliminating the death penalty lead to a reduction of costs? Advocates for the death penalty attribute increased costs to the zealous advocacy of trial and appellate defense attorneys and to advocates for increased protections for the accused and the condemned. It is no solution to eliminate either. Muzzling your opponents is not rational debate, but instead an exercise in tyrannical power. Just how much of the cost associated with a murder prosecution is attributable to the fact that it is a murder rather than the fact that it is a death penalty prosecution? Perhaps the expense is associated more with the crime of murder than with the death penalty punishment itself. If the death penalty were eliminated, would this result in an overall reduction in costs, or would the costs simply be transferred a level down onto life sentences? Whether the death penalty serves a deterrent function is also subject to question and is used by both sides. Again, the difficulty in objectively measuring the question combined with the polarization of the sides makes this issue hard to resolve academically. Further, the sides often confuse deterrence with specific deterrence. General deterrence is the impact the threat of legal punishment has on the public at large. Specific deterrence is the impact of the actual legal punishment on those who are apprehended. While my view is that the death penalty does not serve general deterrence, there is a case that it may serve specific deterrence in certain situations. This assertion is based on my experience in murder motivations, that being that most murders are fundamentally irrational. For deterrence to work, the deterred criminal must be a rational actor. More on this later. With costs and deterrence, it is difficult to separate the advocacy research from the objective questions. These arguments are used by both sides, so it might have been better to consider it a wash. Ultimately, I would suggest that neither costs nor deterrence should be the decisive issue. Given the fact that they are used by both sides, I thought it better to list them under both the pro and con sides and let the reader sort it out. Chapter 5. Death is different. The Supreme Court of the United States aptly noted in 2002 that death is different. Death is final, for which no further appeal may be taken.
Mhm.
Once the sentence of death is carried out, no further investigation will matter, nor will evolving legal standards have any effect. A death sentence deprives the condemned of all further process and redemption. Due process must be provided before any life is taken by the government. How much process is due to a defendant facing the death penalty? When dealing with a speeding ticket, a minimal amount of process is due. A misdemeanor results in somewhat more process, including the right.
This is where his next book is called Maximum Due Process, because it is specific on the legislation, the mandatory legislation that frames the actual death penalty itself. And he explains why it requires that.
Right to a jury trial. A felony charge deserves quite a large amount of process. The death penalty? I would argue that the maximum penalty should draw the maximum process.
Mm-hmm.
By this, I mean that doubts as to process should be resolved in favor of an accused who is facing the death penalty. Constitutionally, man-created penalties must be checked by due process. The ultimate deprivation of life must be checked by maximum due process. While I was serving on the local judicial nominating commission, that narrows candidates for judicial positions, we asked a candidate about his position on the death penalty. His answer was very wise. Quote, "It should not be easy for the state to kill," end quote. There was a lot of wisdom there. I have not found an argument against that sentiment. What does maximum process mean in actual practice? Prosecutors and judges are accustomed to defense attorneys agreeing to things. In death cases, there is no quarter given. The defense must raise every objection. Almost any defense is allowed. Experts must be retained for individualized mental examination. Further experts may need to be retained depending on the facts of an individualized case. In preparation for the penalty phase of a death penalty trial, a comprehensive mitigation analysis with each capital defendant must be conducted, which requires immediate employment by the defense of a mitigation expert, a costly requirement. Mitigation is a comprehensive review of a defendant's life to find reasons the death sentence should not be imposed. At the penalty phase, there is a heightened level of due process. Thus, many evidentiary rules that would keep out much evidence in a normal case must be uncovered and considered by the defense attorney prior to trial. This applies especially to mitigation evidence. A capital trial practitioner with whom I regularly work, Ms. Rosemary Peoples, advises her clients facing charges of homicide upon first meeting that they are 18 to 24 months out from picking a jury. When the homicide includes the death penalty, she anticipates the time to jury selection will extend to over 2 years. This is in northern Florida. Some jurisdictions have much longer time frames. As they should, the state takes murder very seriously. Specialized forensic teams are called whenever a homicide occurs.
Did you hear that?
This brings to bear
2 years for jury selection. 2 years for a death penalty case. And I didn't mention, but whilst I remember, I'm going to take a little bit of time off. So my next stream is not going to be until next year. Sorry. Sorry.
all the science and investigatory resources of the state. This means that a typical homicide case will involve a minimum of 50 witnesses and sometimes involve hundreds of witnesses. Each of these witnesses must be subject to deposition, which requires extensive preparation by the defense team. That defense team must investigate the case for themselves. It is not enough for the police and prosecutors to investigate the case. The defense must also investigate and question every expert with their own independent experts prior to depositions. Delay regularly occurs at the trial level because the attorneys involved in the case must coordinate their calendars with each other and with the witnesses. Depositions sometimes need to be repeated due to disclosures made during the discovery process. The trial itself requires weeks of court time. Jury voir dire, fancy words for jury selection, must be comprehensive, in-depth, and individualized. During the guilt phase of the trial, the numerous witnesses must be presented to the jury and cross-examined by the defense team. If a guilty verdict is reached, The second trial then begins. This is called the penalty phase. The penalty phase question is whether the convicted defendant gets a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole or death. During the penalty phase, the state must prove certain factual aggravators to the jury. Aggravators are reasons to impose the death penalty, such as multiple murders. The defense then presents mitigation to the jury. While it might not be expected, defendants may not wish to present any mitigation. As an example, first-degree murderer James Barnes, from our neck of the woods in Brevard County, Florida, did not want his trial attorneys to develop or present any mitigation. Over his objections, the trial court appointed counsel to develop penalty phase evidence. His appellate attorney, and my division chief here in Daytona, argued that Barnes was entitled, under the Sixth Amendment, to waive the presentation of mitigation evidence. The jury is asked to render a verdict on whether the aggravators outweigh the mitigators. If they do, then the jury is asked if the jury recommends death. If they do not, then the sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole. If the jury recommends death, the case is set for sentencing by the judge. The defense team is given an opportunity to present further mitigation evidence to the judge outside the presence of the jury. This hearing is called a Spencer hearing and provides a defendant the opportunity to provide mitigation evidence to the judge that may not have jury appeal, but would be a reason for the court to impose life rather than death. This was named after a 1993 Florida case, Spencer versus Florida, which was successfully argued by my first appellate division chief, James Wolchek. After this presentation, the judge must weigh the aggravators and mitigators himself and draft a written order assigning weight to each factor found by the jury. If he finds the aggravators outweigh the mitigators, the judge may impose the death penalty. However, he is not required to do so. But wait, there's more. Once a person is convicted and sentenced to death, there is mandatory Florida Supreme Court review for every sentence of death. In Florida, this mandatory review cannot be waived by the condemned.
No.
A death penalty appeal is necessarily complex. The records are generally the largest that arrive at the appellate office doorstep. Records exceeding 10,000 pages are not uncommon. Criminal attorneys consider capital practice to be the Mount Everest of the field, and for good reason. As a criminal practitioner for many years, including many years as a Florida board-certified criminal trial lawyer, I feel that I am only beginning to understand the depth required of the capital practice. There is extraordinary complexity in the issues involved in the death penalty. A deep understanding of constitutional law is required. At the conclusion of the process, there is a mandatory oral argument and written opinion from the Florida Supreme Court. Often, the Florida Supreme Court requires many months to issue its ruling. Once the mandatory Florida Supreme Court review is over, there are state post-conviction motions which are available to the condemned. There is also the federal appellate process, which is another complex area of law. The right to counsel, guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment, requires that counsel be appointed to aid indigent defendants in this complex process. In Florida, this function is handled by the Justice Administrative Commission's Capital Collateral Regional Council's death penalty appeals.
So long.
Unlike the mandatory direct appeal, the post-conviction motion practice can be waived by the client. At the end of this process, the governor must sign a death warrant. This process is arbitrary and opaque. Who gets a death warrant signed and who does not is completely within the powers of the governor. The most recent Florida execution, as of this writing, was Louis Gaskin from Flagler County, Florida, my old stomping ground as a prosecutor. When his death warrant was signed, Gaskin petitioned the court for discovery into the process by which his name, from the over 300 persons on death row, was selected. The trial court refused this request. The appellate courts affirmed this ruling, effectively stating that neither he nor the public had a right to know how the selections are made. Gaskin was executed 33 years after the murders he committed. For some insight into the quickest a person could possibly be put to death, we should look to the case of Glenn Ocha, aka Raven Raven. Mr. Raven fully confessed and cooperated with the police when first arrested. He demanded to be put to death for his crime. He refused all help at the trial level, including waiving all mitigation evidence on his behalf, seeking to be quickly put to death by the state. Our appellate division chief, George Burton, represented Mr. Ocha at the appellate level, which he sought to waive but could not. Once through the appellate process, he waived all further representation, anxious for a quick execution. The time from crime to execution was approximately 6 years. In summary, before an execution takes place, there must be a crime punishable by death. What follows is extensive investigation, discovery, 2 trials, guilt phase and penalty phase, a mandatory direct appeal not waivable by the defendant, post-conviction motion practice, federal appeals and motion practice, a governor warrant, and emergency state and federal appeals. Chapter 6. Death Penalty Case Law Evolution. Constitutional background. John Locke, in the two treatises of civil government, stated that natural law obliged all human beings not to harm the life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. Often this is shortened to life, liberty, and property. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson borrowed the phrase, changing it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notably, both provisions contained as the first right that of life. Given that the protection of life is foundational to the American theory of government, what does the Constitution have to say about capital punishment? The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution states, "No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger." This provision requires, rather non-controversially, the state to utilize the instrument of grand jury indictment whenever they seek the death penalty. The Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution commands that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Is the death penalty cruel and unusual? This question divides. Constitutional originalists see the existence of the death penalty in the early history of the country as decisive. Liberals take a more expansive view of the Constitution. They would expand the Eighth Amendment to bar the death penalty in its entirety. They say that the death penalty is by definition a cruel and unusual punishment. Much of the modern jurisprudence is grounded in the more expansive view of the Constitution. Conservatives would retort that this is wish fulfillment being projected onto the document. Whether the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment is outside the scope of this tome, but be aware that this issue is by no means settled. A due process clause exists within both the Fifth and 14th Amendments. The due process clause of the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution states, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The due process clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution states, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Under due process, a citizen may not be deprived of life without due process of law. This implies that given sufficient process, the state can deprive a citizen of life. The federal government has codified this in relation to treason. In Article 3, Section 3 of the United States Constitution, treason is specifically limited to levying war against the U.S. or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Under U.S. Code Title 18, the penalty includes death or not less than 5 years imprisonment with a minimum fine of $10,000 if not sentenced to death. The modern era. The modern era of the death penalty began with the landmark 1972 Supreme Court ruling in Furman v. Georgia. The court held that the death penalty, as then administered, was unconstitutionally arbitrary and capricious. Since that time, the Supreme Court of the United States regularly weighs in on the constitutionality of the death penalty. What follows is by no means a comprehensive review of the court's death penalty jurisprudence, but is simply meant to give the reader a guidebook for conceptualizing the present state of the death penalty in the United States. Capital punishment is reserved only for first-degree murder and crimes against the state. In Coker v. Georgia, 1977, the Supreme Court of the United States held that the death penalty for rape of an adult woman was grossly disproportionate and excessive punishment, and therefore unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution. A few states continued to have child rape statutes that authorized the death penalty. In Kennedy v. Louisiana, 2008, the court expanded Coker, ruling that the death penalty is unconstitutional in all cases that do not involve homicide or crimes against the state. No crimes can carry an automatic death penalty. In Woodson v. North Carolina, 1976, the court held that mandatory death sentences are unconstitutional. The court rejected a mandatory death penalty scheme in companion cases to Gregg v. Georgia, 1976, because the Eighth Amendment requires, quote, individualized consideration, unquote. In this set of cases, which opened the door to new death penalty enabling statutes, the court required that any death penalty scheme provide objective criteria to direct and limit the death sentencing discretion, and that the objectiveness of these criteria must in turn be ensured by appellate review of all death sentences. Also, the court stated that in any new death penalty scheme, the sentencer is required to consider the individualized character of a defendant. The Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution provides that criminal defendants are entitled to a fair and impartial jury who will follow the law. The court has interpreted this to mean that citizens facing the death penalty are entitled to a jury that will consider mitigation and follow the law. Wainwright v. Witt, 1985. This has a direct impact on death penalty jury selection, as many pro-death penalty citizens refuse to look at or consider any mitigation provided by the defense. Jurors who will not consider mitigation evidence cannot be fair as a matter of constitutional law. Defendants are entitled to a juror strike for cause if the prospective juror's views would prevent or substantially impair the performance of his duties as a juror. The right to a fair and impartial jury means that there can be no automatic death voting jurors. In a 6-3 ruling, the court in Atkins v. Virginia, 2002, held that there can be no death penalty for the mentally impaired. While Mr. Atkins had a full-scale IQ of 59, what is considered mental impairment can be a fine line and subject to much expert wrangling. The basis for criminal culpability is mens rea, or culpable mind. Without a guilty mind, it makes no sense to punish someone for a harmful act. Restated, if someone does not intend to injure another, then they should not be punished. Childhood brain development dictates that moral culpability for actions are less when the brain is not fully matured. Along these lines, the court ruled that there can be no death penalty for juveniles. There is quite a bit of recent research regarding the brain development of juveniles. Lack of self-control seems to be a hallmark of the teenage years, and in fact may have been an essential component for our survival as a species. But how the childhood development of the brain impacts criminal mens rea is a question that the court must wrestle with. Here is a thought experiment for those of you who are unconvinced. Would it be appropriate to execute a 2-year-old for murder? No? Why not? What about an 8-year-old? 12? Where should the line be drawn? A brief non-death penalty interlude. The whole concept of juvenile sanctions recalls this entertaining line of cases that illustrates the arrogance and condescension we Florida defense attorneys regularly face when advancing concepts against settled questions before a hostile court. The Florida state appellate courts were regularly presented with claims by appellate public defenders challenging sentences of life without the possibility of parole for juveniles who commit non-homicide offenses. We argued over and over that if the offense was committed when the defendant was 14 years old, such a sentence was cruel and unusual punishment. In 2008, one Florida appellate court expressed its frustration. Quote, "The issue these lawyers raise is worthy of public debate, and they may feel strongly about it, but they must know that this post-conviction claim is procedurally barred in state court at this time. They do not assist their client or their cause by filing a motion that has no legal merit or by failing to disclose the federal case law dealing directly with their client." End quote. Just 2 years later, the Supreme Court weighed in. Quote, "This court now holds that for a juvenile offender who does not commit homicide, the Eighth Amendment forbids the sentence of life without parole." End quote. The lesson here is that courts are fickle and dismissive of change, but that advocates should not give up their arguments just because they are meeting resistance. End of interlude. The death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. As discussed earlier in Gregg, there must be a distinction between ordinary first-degree murder and first-degree murder that carries the death penalty. To accomplish this, a state legislature must set out criteria for distinguishing between the two by listing factors that make first-degree murder eligible for the death penalty. These are called aggravators, and in Florida, at least one aggravator must be found for a first-degree murder case to be eligible for the death penalty. The Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees the right to a jury trial. The role of the jury is that of fact finder, as well laid out by the court in Apprendi versus New Jersey, 2000. The Sixth Amendment does not permit a defendant to be exposed to a penalty exceeding the maximum he would receive if punished according to the facts reflected in the jury verdict alone. Under Apprendi, because an aggravator is a fact that enhances the sentence, the jury must make this finding. A judge may not make a finding of aggravation. Following Apprendi, the court has held that judicially imposed death penalties are unconstitutional. In Hurst v. Florida, 2016, the court, in an 8-1 vote, struck down Florida's death penalty scheme because it allowed a judge to impose a death sentence, relying on aggravating factors that were not necessarily found by the jury. Non-unanimous juries are unconstitutional. In Ramos versus Louisiana, 2020, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution requires that guilty verdicts be unanimous in trials for serious crimes. Florida's old non-unanimous jury verdict scheme was found unconstitutional by the Florida Supreme Court after the case was remanded from the Supreme Court of the United States. The law was found to be unconstitutional because it requires that only 10 jurors recommend death, as opposed to the constitutionally required unanimous 12-member jury. The Sixth Amendment requires a jury unanimously to find the existence of a statutory aggravating circumstance. This was later abrogated by the Florida Supreme Court, which cannot seem to make up its mind on this issue, weighing political pressure against constitutional coherence. Florida's recently enacted 2023 non-unanimous jury scheme poses this challenge to the courts. Does each statutory aggravator have to be found unanimously by the jury to impose death? This may be beyond the scope of this book, but as a sneak peek into an original derivation of the unanimity requirement, I propose the following reasoning aside from an appeal to the case law authorities cited above. A. The American justice system relies on juries. B. Criminal defendants have a right to a trial by a jury of their peers. C. Unreasonable individuals are struck for cause and therefore are excluded from juries. D. Juries are assumed to be made up of reasonable individuals. E. Juries are the finders of fact. F. Beyond a reasonable doubt is the criminal standard. G. As found in Gregg, for a death penalty scheme to be constitutional, there must be aggravators that allow for a distinction between regular first-degree murder and death-qualified first-degree murder. H. Thus, the legislatures set up a series of factual aggravators that must be found beyond a reasonable doubt by a jury before the death penalty can be imposed. I. To invoke the death penalty, aggravating factors must be found beyond a reasonable doubt by juries. J. If there is a dispute about a fact among 12 reasonable individuals, there is necessarily a reasonable doubt. A non-unanimous jury means that at least one juror has reasonable doubt. Thus, a non-unanimous verdict is by definition not beyond a reasonable doubt. Therefore, it is unlawful, unconstitutional, for a law to permit a punishment of death when the jury was not unanimous because it could not have found aggravating factors beyond a reasonable doubt. What do you think? Chapter 7. Why the death penalty is a net positive for society. Vengeance. The death penalty satisfies the human desire for vengeance. Anger at the horrific facts surrounding murder motivates many supporters of the death penalty. Vicious and indefensible fact patterns drive people to wish for the most extreme consequence to be visited on the perpetrator. This human desire is contained within every person, and it has a powerful emotional appeal. Similarly, most people tend to advocate for the most extreme punishment imaginable when confronted with the brutal facts typically surrounding first-degree murders. Humanity is vengeful. The death penalty, advocates contend, satisfies the public's demand for vengeance against the murderer. Advocates may admit that the death penalty is an emotional appeal to vengeance, but would counter that this is also true of life in prison. Retribution, they argue, is only served by the penalty of death. Incapacitation. Life in prison does not bar the possibility of escape or early release. Only by the administration of the death penalty can society be assured that the prisoner will not murder again. Thus, proponents argue, it is a matter of societal self-defense to remove these persons from the living. Additionally, a life sentence does not prevent the convicted from murdering additional people while in prison. It is true that people serving life in prison can commit an additional murder by targeting their fellow inmates or prison guards. However, I can find no example of a prisoner on death row killing another person. Further, an actual escape from modern prison is extremely rare. Delays while awaiting the death sentence tend to devalue this as a consideration, since the condemned person will be able to kill within the system for many years, just as a lifer would be. Proportionality. The death penalty is proportional to the crime of murder. This is the true eye for an eye argument. In a society that values life, the death penalty is the ultimate penalty that is proportional to the act of first-degree murder. A death penalty proponent will argue that there is no additional sanction for a person serving life in prison when they kill a prison guard or a fellow inmate. Consecutive life sentences do not serve differentiated punishment goals. That means that someone with 2 murders gets the same sentence as someone who commits 1 murder. But this is also true of life sentences. Further, there is only one execution, no matter how many murders.
Not.
When multiple murders are involved,
I could not have chosen a messier dinner to have. My God. I thought, nice and easy. Rice paper rolls. Easy. No, not. I have got sticky hands and vermicelli from arsehole to breakfast. I'm going to go and wash up. I'll be 2 minutes.
the death penalty can also be disproportional to the offense. A death penalty scheme simply moves the crimes wherein a proportionate punishment is administered up one rung of the ladder. Advocates for a death penalty would argue that this rung should be available for society. Equity. Advocates for the death penalty argue that the state makes a moral statement when executing a murderer. A just society demonstrates its profound commitment to the sanctity of human life by demanding the life of those who would unjustly take the life of another. Life in prison offends the sense of equity in that the punishment, life in prison, seems less than the crime, the taking of innocent life. Thus, without the death penalty, it feels as if society is valuing the life of the murderer over the life of the innocent victim. On the whole discussion of value of lives, they view people advocating against the death penalty as viewing the lives lost as inherently less valuable than the life of the perpetrator. A death penalty proponent would argue that there should be no point of contemplation. The death of the perpetrator at the hands of the state is not fundamentally worse than the deaths of the victims. Utility. There is going to be a top penalty regardless, and eliminating the death penalty will just redirect the efforts to a lower rung. Thus, the death penalty should be provided to prosecutors as a prosecutorial tool that can be used to extract pleas in mandatory life cases. Life without the possibility of parole is nothing more than the next incremental step in the erosion of punishment, and once the slippery slope is traversed, further erosions will follow. Once the death penalty is removed, the next incremental block to be pushed over is the no parole portion, and the next advocate position will be that life without parole is cruel and unusual punishment and violates the Constitution. This is nothing more than incrementalism at its worst, the destruction of values and morals that will only lead to more violence and crime. Eventually, you will get to the point that the most heinous of crimes will be punished by a few years in jail and nothing more. Perfection cannot be the standard. The only way to ensure that no innocent person is wrongfully convicted is to not prosecute anyone. Since this is not reasonable, we do the best that we can. On balance, there are many more murderers than there are innocent persons on death row. No perfect system is possible, and the protections of the process are sufficient to protect the innocent. The Constitution places limitations on the exercise of the death penalty. The protections afforded by the Constitution, including the due process clauses and the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, are the best that can be expected from any human institution. When the state carries out an execution, it does so in a limited and fair manner given these limitations. Appellate review. A life without parole sentence gets a much lower level of appellate review than a death sentence. For example, a death row inmate whose sentence is commuted to life without parole would automatically lose the right to state-appointed lawyers to pursue their habeas corpus appeals. Thus, pro-death penalty means heightened procedural checks on the most extreme cases. Specific deterrence. In certain cases, the death penalty may specifically deter murder in certain fact patterns. If you remember, specific deterrence is the impact of the actual legal punishment on those who are apprehended. As an example, a person who rapes a child faces life in prison. If that offender also kills the child to eliminate the witness, they face the additional sanction of death. This may deter a rational person from murdering their victim. Pedophile sex offenders tend to plan out their attacks and approach their crimes very systematically. Therefore, it is possible that in cases of rational murder, specific deterrence is real. General deterrence. Deterrence means that the death punishment should discourage people from murder in cases when a life sentence would not. The question of whether the existence of the death penalty serves as an actual deterrent is hotly debated between the sides. For example, prodeathpenalty.org states, "There are many studies out there that have stated that the death penalty is highly effective when deterring crime. You will find a few studies that have tracked the effects of the death penalty over a few years, and they have all found It is highly effective when deterring crime, end quote. Now note that there are no citations to this claim. I would defer to Dr. Thomas Sowell, who writes, quote, there is no factual proof either way, end quote. In 2006, Dr. Paul Rubin, professor of economics at Emory University, testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee on the death penalty's, quote, strong deterrent effect. Based on his team's analysis, Dr. Rubin asserted that on average, each execution deters 18 murders. He also cited 11 similar studies, including one suggesting that death row sentences and executions deter all types of murders. Cost. Proponents of the death penalty claim that a quickly administered death penalty should cost less than housing a person for life in the prison system. Would an efficiently implemented death penalty cost less than housing someone in prison for life? If they have ideas for improvement, the suggestions need to be specific. Leaving aside utopianism, as discussed above, just how efficient the process could become while still retaining the maximum due process is an open question. This is a hotly contested claim between proponents and opponents. Which elements of a death penalty case would be eliminated in a life case? Similar to deterrence studies, objective academic research on this question leaves the matter open to question. Chapter 8. Why the death penalty is a net negative for society. Life in prison is extremely harsh. Life in prison without the possibility of parole is an extremely harsh punishment. To argue that life without parole sentence is soft on crime is false. Those who think that either life in prison or death row is a comfort zone do not know of what they speak. Listen to someone who had to bunk in prison with someone who was condemned to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Quote, every moment of every day, my bunkie must wrestle with the unfathomable notion that he is expected to sit, hunched on a hard metal bed for an undetermined number of days, slowly dying by inadequate medical care, nutrition, and living conditions plagued by pestilence, amputations, social exclusion, constant emotional debasement, and otherization by a system designed for long-term cruelty. Instead of eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, he is forced to quickly swallow a series of slop-like pseudo-meals 3 times per day, aptly nicknamed chow, as if we were pigs to the slaughter. End quote. Over time, participants in the criminal justice system become callous towards sentencing. Exposure to severe sentences minimizes the harsh reality of multi-year sentences to those doling out the time. Prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys throw around incarceration numbers as if they were nothing at all. I recall the greatest judge I had the honor of practicing with, the late Richard O. Watson. We were dealing with a case that had come back for resentencing. The original sentence was 12 years, and on resentencing, Judge Watson lowered that to 8 years. Being that he was my mentor, and we were quite close professionally, I expressed my disagreement with the lower sentence. He looked down from the bench and said, "Son, 8 years is a long time." Echoing this statement, life in prison is an extremely harsh sentence. A lie. The death penalty is a lie to the survivors. Advocates for the death penalty argue that a sentence of death gives closure for the family. In the real world, it is exactly the opposite. Death penalty litigation continues for years after the original crime. As discussed earlier, structural delay is a necessary part of any capital punishment system. By the time a murderer is put to death, many years will have passed. This delay, which is a necessary reality in any death penalty system, melts away the pro-death penalty retribution argument. The alternative, summary execution, is not a serious proposal in a free society. The prolonged process of capital punishment necessarily keeps family members trapped in a cycle of reliving the crime. The death penalty does not resolve the legacy of pain to surviving family members of the homicide victim. Contacts with the justice system are constant reminders of the unresolved death of their loved one. Every time they get a notice in the mail, they get wounded yet again. Alternatively, a life sentence allows the family to deal with their loss without the continual interference from the criminal justice system. Distraction. The debate over the death penalty is a distraction from the actual debate over reducing crime. Quote, The death penalty draws attention away from effective public safety policies and distorts elections of judges and prosecutors by privileging, quote, tough on crime rhetoric and candidates. A nationwide survey of police chiefs put the death penalty last among their priorities for reducing violent crime, below increasing the number of police officers, reducing drug abuse, and creating a better economy. Surveyed law enforcement officials said they did not believe the death penalty is a deterrent to murder, and they rated it as one of the most inefficient uses of taxpayer dollars in fighting crime, end quote. The size of death row in all states of the United States has hovered around 3,000 since 1990, with executions in the United States.
Tanya, come back. I have a question for you, or a proposal, if you will.
Falling since 2000, from about 85 in that year to 11 in 2021. Now compare those numbers to the homicide rate in the United States. There were 7.8 homicides for every 100,000 people in the United States in 2020, fluctuating between approximately 5.7 and 10.5 per 100,000 since 1970. This translates to between 14,000 and 23,000 murders per year in the United States. Today, there are approximately 1.4 million individuals in prison, and more than 200,000 people are serving life sentences. Politicians promising that the death penalty is a solution to crime are misguided. It is easier to display rage against the worst crimes as a badge of position than to wrestle with real solutions to crime that plagues this country. Rather than placing judges on the bench based on merit, the judiciary is warped by creating a single-issue litmus test for judicial candidates. Politicians are elected based on their position on an issue that has little import to the average citizen, while covering up an honest debate on the real causes of crime. Mental illness, parentless homes, drug addiction, and treatment, hope. All of these important debates are obscured in the posturing and sloganeering by politicians. Arbitrariness. The death penalty is arbitrarily imposed. Much of who gets the death penalty is determined by very few counties within the United States. The likelihood of a death sentence or execution depends more on the county where the crime happened than the severity of the offense. Only 2% of the counties in the U.S. have been responsible for the majority of cases leading to execution since 1976. And only 2% of the counties are responsible for the majority of today's death row population and recent death sentences. All state taxpayers have to bear the substantial financial costs of death penalty cases in the handful of counties that push the death penalty. The death penalty falls disproportionately on the weakest among us. The death penalty is supposed to be reserved for the most culpable. Instead, it's generally inflicted on the most vulnerable. For example, the death penalty is, by and large, imposed against the poor. A poor man has no value. In comparison, society has great investment in a skilled person, such as a doctor, and will preserve his life because his life has more value to the state. While more persuasive to some people than others, it is a statistical truth that racial disparities exist within the system. Black Americans make up 41% of the people on death row and 34% of those executed, but only 13% of the population is Black. 75% of executions for murder were in cases with white victims.
Now you tell me. Oh, I love meatloaf. Oh, Tanya's internet's. She's just moved, and her proper internet isn't getting connected until lunchtime on Monday. So that's she dropped out. Sorry about that. We might go to the end of this chapter, I think, and then call it quits. I think there's enough information for one night. We'll soldier on for now. I'm just about to see if she's keen on the New Year's Eve.
Again, I would cite the great Dr. Thomas Sowell, who provides for a strong intellectual pushback against this position. Unequal application of the death penalty offends equal protection of the laws. If there is a limitation on sentence, then where the line is drawn is a societal choice. The death penalty opponent will state that the maximum penalty that can be supported is life in prison without the possibility of parole. A death penalty advocate will say that the maximum penalty should be death. But why does the line stop there? If the death penalty is allowed as a permissible sentence, then why not torture? Why not crucifixion? The limit to governmentally imposed evil, torturous death is the imagination of the imposer. Any penalty line drawing should be rational. The death penalty is not the maximum sentence. Lack of deterrence. There is no evidence that the death penalty serves as a general deterrence to crime. Deterrence assumes a rational actor. As stated above, murderers do not think they will be caught. As a practitioner of criminal law dealing with thousands of defendants, my observation is that most murderous criminals do not think rationally. They do not think they will be caught, or perhaps better stated, they do not think. Further, most murders are driven by drugs, mental illness, passion, irrationality, disrespect, territoriality, primal instinct, or a combination of these things. None of these motivations are subject to specific deterrence. Contrary to most media opinions, my experience has been that most murders are committed without a rational motive. Discussing this question with my public defender office mates reinforces my suspicion. Defendants generally believe that they will not get caught. Many of the persons on death row are damaged goods defendants. Most murderers have a background of drug abuse, mental illness, broken childhood, etc., or all in combination. These people are not rationally deterred because a basis for deterrence is rationality. The existence of death penalty volunteers undermines the argument that capital punishment is an actual deterrent. Approximately 10% of all death row inmates are volunteers. Our appellate division chief here in the Seventh Circuit, George Burton, provided an example of a death penalty volunteer. Glenn Ocha, aka Raven. In 2005, Ocha would not let a public defender present evidence to avoid execution. After the state Supreme Court affirmed his conviction in 2002, Ocha filed a motion to drop his appeals and dismiss his lawyers. There is evidence that the existence of the death penalty encourages murder within the prison system. This is referred to as, within the prison walls, trading your roommate for a TV. Check out the facts from Fletcher v. State, 2022. Quote, Fletcher appeals his judgment of conviction of first-degree murder and his sentence of death. The court affirmed. In September 2018, while serving a life sentence for the 1994 first-degree murder of Milton Grossman, Fletcher strangled his cellmate Kenneth Davis to death in their cell at the Blackwater River Correctional Facility. Fletcher, who confessed to killing Davis to an FDLE special agent, and in letters he wrote to the trial court, was indicted for first-degree premeditated murder in March of 2019. On August 29, 2019, he pled guilty to first-degree murder in open court, which the court accepted, where he waived the presentation of all mitigating evidence. The trial court was required to order a comprehensive pre-sentence investigation report that included information such as previous mental health problems, school records, and relevant family background. The record shows that the trial court complied with this precedent, and the sentencing order explicitly states that the trial court considered the mitigating evidence from the PSI, which referenced his prior suicide attempt. The record is also clear that the trial court exercised its discretion to appoint an independent special counsel and considered the mitigation presented by special counsel. To the extent he claims fundamental error because the trial court did not appoint experts to assist special counsel with developing and presenting mitigation, defense counsel stated that there was no need to seek to have an expert appointed because he would not cooperate. The trial court was not required to determine beyond a reasonable doubt that the aggravating factors were sufficient to justify death and outweigh the mitigating circumstances. The record indicates that he knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily entered a guilty plea. His conviction and sentence of death are affirmed. End quote. Ultimately, the deterrence question, I believe, is a wash for both sides. The Equal Justice Initiative summed it up well. Quote, after more than 3 decades of research examining whether the threat of death sentence deters people from committing aggravated murders, there is no reliable evidence that the death penalty deters murder or that it protects police. The National Research Council of the National Academies concluded that studies claiming the death penalty has a deterrent effect are fundamentally flawed. Studies have shown that murder rates, including murders of police officers, are consistently higher in states that have the death penalty, while states that have abolished the death penalty have the lowest rates of police officers killed in the line of duty. Cost. Death penalty opponents argue that the death penalty is far more expensive than a system in which life imprisonment without parole is the maximum sentence. Sophisticated studies at the state level show that the death penalty cost taxpayers more than life without parole. One 2016 study found that the death penalty costs approximately 4 times what it would to house a prisoner for life.
Shit.
This is by no means a complete list, but here are some factors that contribute to increased costs for the taxpayer when a death penalty system is maintained. Mitigation experts. When a death case hits the trial division, the defense must immediately hire a mitigation expert to prepare for the anticipated penalty phase of trial.
Yep.
These experts charge tens of thousands of dollars upfront. That money is expended in all cases where the state seeks
So-
death, which is a much larger circle.
I don't know if you've watched or anyone's been watching the Koberger case. They have just basically gone through, like, literally a shit ton of motions why, like, opposing the death penalty in his case. And they're pretty much, they're motions that the trial judge doesn't have the legislation to rule upon, so he has to mandatory deny them, but they have to be filed so that they can be addressed when they come to the mandatory appeals process part of the death penalty trial. So they've pretty much got to file a motion for every one of the apparent supposed aggravating factors. So anything that they think could be attached to a reason why he should be put to death has to be addressed in a motion and then denied by the trial court so that it can be addressed on the appellate court after the sentencing at the sentencing phase. It's and there is no limit on the defense's like it's they could add 300 aggregating factors in motions. There is no limit to what they can apply because it's maximum due process. So yeah. So they've just done that. That's what they've just gotten through in the Koberger case.
Well, than those who actually get there. Expert witnesses. Because the state expends maximum resources in homicide cases, this generates a reciprocal need for the defense to hire experts to review the expert testimony offered by the state. Quality of the defense attorney. The death penalty requires the commitment of the best lawyers. These lawyers must be retained and employed over time. By the way, I need a raise. Quantity of counsel. A death penalty case requires a team of attorneys on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Multiple attorneys reduce staffing levels in non-capital arenas. For example, in our appellate office, when a death penalty case is assigned, that attorney is taken off of the regular rotation for at least 90 days. Note, too, that these are the best attorneys in the office who are taken away from every other duty. Attorney time shortfalls must be met with additional staff. Death penalty requires a stable of death penalty qualified private conflict counsel. Refusal of the state to adequately compensate the very few death qualified private attorneys will lead to the refusal of those defense attorneys to participate in this system. Long pretrial processes and long jury trials suck up huge amounts of resources, including court time, judge time, meaning more judges, court reporter time, bailiff and security time, and extra physical plant, courtrooms. For example, a 2013 study published in the University of Denver Criminal Law Review found that Colorado life without parole cases required an average of 24.5 days of in-court time, while the death penalty cases required 147.6 days. Similarly, a 2013 study showed the Idaho State Appellate Public Defender's Office spent about 44 times more time on a typical death penalty appeal than on a life sentence appeal. As a death-qualified practitioner in the area of criminal appeals in Florida, the Idaho finding comports with my experience. I generally handle between 50 and 60 direct appeals every year. This averages out to about 1 appeal per week. During this time, I also train trial and appellate level attorneys and engage in multiple out-of-office activities. When a death case comes in, it dominates my appellate practice, with around 80 days minimum on just that one brief. The death penalty is an expensive government program that is ineffective in deterring crime. International relations. The death penalty complicates international relations. Americans tend to ignore other countries. This trait is grounded in tradition and power. Historically, isolationism is a common response by America to a confused and warlike world. The idea of Fortress America is to gather the strength of the nation behind two large oceans and tend to our own business. I am in complete agreement that the U.S. Constitution is the highest law of the land. Conservatives bristle at any suggestion that international law has any force over the United States. In the United States, the Constitution is preeminent. This view is supported by current federal jurisprudence. For example, in Medellin versus Texas, 2008, the United States Supreme Court held that even when a treaty constitutes an international commitment, it is not binding domestic law unless it has been implemented by an act of the U.S. Congress or contains language expressing that it is self-executing upon ratification. The court also ruled that decisions of the International Court of Justice are not binding domestic law and, like treaties, cannot be enforced by the President of the United States without authority from Congress or the U.S. Constitution. Regardless of the correctness of this, the United States is but one country sharing the planet with numerous others. Many of those less powerful countries do not have the luxury of ignoring their national neighbors. Clearly, in the present historical moment, the United States has the power to ignore the rest of the world, but the question is whether it should. The death penalty places the United States in the company of tyranny. The top 6 executing nations in 2019 were China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, and the United States. Many opponents of the death penalty are uncomfortable being placed in this select company. Undermined state authority. The death penalty erodes the moral authority of the state. The death penalty is an emotional appeal to vengeance. Notable is the Nazi war criminal executioner Albert Pierpoint. He wrote in his memoir that the death penalty did not deter a single person and only served as a means of revenge. Quote, "I don't believe that the hundreds of executions I was responsible for prevented even a single murder," he explained. The death penalty solves nothing, end quote. As discussed earlier, emotional appeals undermine the rule of law. The death penalty encourages an appeal to the bloodlust of the public by politicians. How does one get off death row? The mysterious governor's warrant. This is the last procedural hurdle between the condemned and execution. This final process is tapped into at the whim of the politician who wants to escort someone out of their cell onto death row and strap them into a chair to be killed. Do we want our politicians to be playing these games for votes? How is a family member of an executed person supposed to view the state? I recently interviewed a friend of an executed man. She stated, quote, "My classmate and close friend was put to death by the state of Virginia, and I saw the effects it had on his family, especially his father," end quote. In that interview, she revealed her deeply conflicted feelings towards the state after the execution. She observed her friend's father, who took the ashes of his son for long rides in his truck. Several years passed as the father gave up on life and slowly withered away and died of heartbreak. Limited government. As a matter of governmental limitation, the state should not have the power to execute its own citizens. While conducting research for this book, it became apparent that pro-death penalty arguments are not as organized or available as those.
This is why I don't think I can do it justice. I agree, Anna. I've done nothing but like listen and listen and listen and listen, because there is there's so much to it. It's so complex, and I don't think an hour's podcast is going to get through 3 books. I'm sorry, we've still got an hour left of this book, but you're right. It is absolutely fascinating. I've just been like, it's just compelled me. I put it on beside my bed and later listen to it. It's amazing. But yeah, it is really, really, really deep. And he addresses everything fairly.
Opposed to capital punishment. The main proponent of the death penalty seems to be the state. The state wants the death penalty as a tool to be used against the people.
Mm-hmm.
Why is the state so intent on retaining this power?
Yep.
Advocates for limited government should question why they would delegate this ultimate power to unchecked prosecutors.
Yep.
Recent revelations of corruption at the highest levels of government should give any death penalty.
So he's now mentioning the word corruption. He's in Florida. Can you imagine what effects that would have on death penalty cases? Like, he goes into it.
Penalty supporter, great pause. Empowering the government to impose the death penalty on the worst of the worst also allows that power to be used against marginal cases and as a bargaining chip against people who are not guilty of first-degree murder, but perhaps a lesser charge. Thus, the death penalty increases state power against its citizens. Systematic problems. The death penalty goes hand in hand with weakened safeguards for defendants. This is very true in the example I know, the state of Florida. Florida is not only extremely aggressive with the death penalty, but has systematically packed the judiciary with pro-prosecution judges. These judges, in turn, systematically erode defense arguments and criminal defenses generally. So we have the worst of both, a weakened ability to defend, combined with unchecked prosecutorial power in death penalty states.
A weakened ability to defend and an unchecked prosecutorial power because they've been voted and elected in. Where are the scales? Let me go back that 1 second. Listen to what he's
Not as organized or available as those opposed to capital punishment. The main proponent of the death penalty seems to be the state. The state wants the death penalty as a tool to be used against the people. Why is the state so intent on retaining this power? Advocates for limited government should question why they would delegate this ultimate power to unchecked prosecutors. Recent revelations of corruption at the highest levels of government should give any death penalty supporter great pause. Empowering the government to impose the death penalty on the worst of the worst also allows that power to be used against marginal cases and as a bargaining chip against people who are not guilty of first-degree murder, but perhaps a lesser charge. Thus, the death penalty increases state power against its citizens. Systematic problems. The death penalty goes hand in hand with weakened safeguards for defendants. This is very true in the example I know, the state of Florida. Florida is not only extremely aggressive with the death penalty, but has systematically packed the judiciary with pro-prosecution judges.
right.
These
So
judges, in turn,
all the judges they've now are pro prosecution, so they're pro death. All right. So Florida's majority of judges are pro the death penalty. All right.
systematically erode defense arguments and criminal defenses generally.
So they erode all of the criminal defense attorneys' arguments and what do you call them? Resources.
So we have the worst of both, a weakened ability to defend,
That gives them a weakened ability. The defense attorneys then have like the weakest strength. They don't have enough resources to effectively defend a defense. Oh my God, go to bed, Jody. They don't have the same resources as the prosecutors to adequately defend a death penalty case. And the prosecutors and the judge are pretty much all pro death penalty. So how do you get a fair trial? Because as you said before, once you've gone through the sentencing phase and the jury have heard all of your aggravating factors, you then have the opportunity to then present additional factors for review outside of the presence of the jury to the judge alone. So the judge can then either decide to impose a death penalty or put it back on the jury. And now they've reduced it to, I think it's 8-4. It doesn't even have to be a unanimous verdict by the jury to convict the death penalty. They're just making up the rules to suit themselves.
combined with unchecked prosecutorial power in death penalty states. As an example of the weakening safeguards, I would point to the circumstantial evidence rule. This rule was developed by the common law and states that circumstantial evidence which leaves uncertain several hypotheses, any one of which may be sound and some of which may be entirely consistent with innocence, is not adequate to sustain a verdict of guilt. It has now been wiped away by the Florida Supreme Court. In dissent, Cuban refugee Justice Jorge Labarga sharply criticized what he called the court's sweeping decision to abandon the heightened standard of review in all criminal cases that are based solely on circumstantial evidence, end quote. Quote, for more than 100 years, Labarga wrote, this court has applied a more stringent standard of review in reviewing convictions supported only by circumstantial evidence. Yet today, this court eliminates another reasonable safeguard in our death penalty jurisprudence and in Florida's criminal law across the board, end quote. While very much in the weeds to us capital practitioners, Florida makes it easier to kill its citizens by abandoning the long-standing practice of individual proportionality review. This is an individualized process by which the court compares the underlying crime against other murders to determine if it is in fact the worst of the worst. Justice Labarga, again, filed an excellent dissent. In it, he warns, quote, I cannot overstate how quickly and consequentially the majority's decisions have impacted death penalty law in Florida, end quote. When the rules do not favor the state, they change them. The Florida Bar's Criminal Jury Instructions Committee, for example, excludes defense attorneys from their makeup. There is very little, if any, enforcement of prosecutorial Brady disclosure requirements, nor is there any enthusiasm for the prosecutors to comply with such things. It is not unreasonable to conclude the more a state government favors a death penalty, the less protections are accorded the accused. Government murder. Government cannot be trusted with the power of death over its citizens. When compared to deaths by crime, governments take murder to a whole new level. There are many examples throughout history of humanity using the instrument of government to kill opponents. There are many examples, but a lawful death penalty can quickly spiral out of control. For example, the bloody assizes of 1685 were an influential event on the Founding Fathers and their insistence for limitations on government. As part of the Monmouth Rebellion during the English Civil War, the English king cracked down on opponents of the royal rule. Over 300 were brutally executed for the state's favorite device, treason. The sentences included the extreme execution method of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Modern sensibilities would probably be shocked to learn of the modes by which the death penalty was carried out half a millennia ago. Our Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment restriction was directed at just such torturous methods of execution. The Eighth Amendment would most certainly prevent a modern government from carrying out executions that involve being drawn and quartered. The French Revolution is another example of out-of-control government use of capital punishment. Specifically, during the Reign of Terror, taking place between 1793 and 1794, the utopian leftists perfected the execution of enemies of the state via use of the modern guillotine device. Between 35,000 and 40,000 French citizens were executed. The justification for the murders by the state was treason. One lesson from history that could be fairly drawn is that if you kill enough people, you can avoid the death penalty. Perhaps most applicable to the death penalty, the Green River killer Gary Ridgway killed at least 49 persons in the 1980s and 90s.
Kill enough people, you can avoid
as part of a plea bargain wherein he agreed to disclose the locations of many of his murder victims. He was spared the death penalty and received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Absolutely.
Let us compare Ridgway's killing spree with those of some of our most infamous governmental leaders.
Which is why
Joseph Stalin murdered possibly 20 million people. Uncle Joe died of natural causes.
And so it should. You know, it's not something that should be taken lightly. And I don't think I have given it enough even thought during trials. Like, it's like, oh yeah, okay, this one's a death penalty. Like, it's certainly going to alter the way I look at death penalty trials in the future. Plus, knowledge is power, you know? We're learning. It's fascinating to me. Absolutely fascinating.
Mao Zedong murdered upwards of 80 million people in a fit of communist fervor. Mao died of natural causes. Pol Pot, who may have murdered upwards of a third of the population of Cambodia, died of a heart attack after losing power. Yet criminal murderers, such as our first double homicide example, Mr. Joseph Rudolph Wood III, are the primary recipients of our state's execution power. Moral rot. The death penalty injects an element of moral corruption into the participants within the criminal justice system. The process of execution itself is ugly. People make any death system work.
Yep.
Any system whose objective is death generates insidious psychological impacts on those who are called upon by the society to run it.
Yep.
For example, post-traumatic stress disorder
Oh,
among criminal defense lawyers.
This got me. This really got me. I didn't even think about it.
He was spared the death penalty and received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Let us compare Ridgway's killing spree with those of some of our most infamous governmental leaders. Joseph Stalin murdered
I went too
possibly
far, sorry.
20 million people. First double homicide example, Mr.
Yeah.
Joseph Rudolph Wood III, are the primary recipients of our state's execution power. Moral rot. The death penalty injects an element of moral corruption into the participants within the criminal justice system. The process of execution itself is ugly. People make any death system work.
Yep.
Any system whose objective is death generates insidious psychological impacts on those who are called upon by the society to run it. For example, post-traumatic stress disorder among criminal defense lawyers dealing with death penalty cases is not unknown.
Post-traumatic stress disorder from criminal lawyers dealing with death penalty patients, with death penalty clients. They're suffering PTSD. What does that tell you?
Erosion is a defensive mechanism within humanity to allow participation in a system that would otherwise be viewed as evil. Instead of admitting complicity with evil, the participants justify what they are doing as good.
Mm-hmm.
Consider the effect of such moral justifying from each of these perspectives. The executioner, the prison guards, death penalty prosecutor, the judge, the defense attorneys, and the jurors. Extreme sentences also numb the perceptions of the participants so that what would normally be considered grotesque is normalized.
Yep.
These impacts are quite subtle and impossible to measure, but they are there, and such moral erosion on our citizenry should not be minimized. Martyrs. The death penalty is destabilizing for the Republic by allowing the creation of martyrs. American patriot Nathan Hale said in 1776, quote, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," end quote. These were his last words before he was hanged for spying on British troops. This statement became a rallying cry for the overthrow of British rule. John Brown, being executed by the Union, was a primary factor in the divide that led to the Civil War. Brown's last words were, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done," end quote. The division that rippled through the North and the South as a result of Brown's execution led directly to the outbreak of the Civil War, which killed upwards of 1 million Americans. These American examples are way in the past and have no relevance to today, right? Well, let's think about that.
Mm-hmm.
What if the government filed treason charges against President Trump? Do we trust the Department of Justice, FBI, Washington, D.C. juries? What if he was executed? Would that lead to a civil war? Take our present politicians out of the equation. There is a not so insignificant danger that an unjust application of the death penalty against a political opponent could spark a civil war. Under United States case law, the death penalty is available, not only for first-degree murder, but also enemies of the state. Political martyrs are common when the death penalty is exerted against political opponents. Civil war is only one danger. If such political executions are tolerated, then it becomes even worse. The submission of the populace to injustice would result in absolute tyranny of those in power, just what the statists desire. National movements are fueled by political martyrs. A Philippines example is Jose Rizal. An ophthalmologist, writer, and polymath, Rizal is widely considered one of the greatest heroes of the Philippines. The Spanish executed Rizal for his political writings. His martyrdom galvanized opposition to Spanish colonial rule. In England, Sir Thomas More springs to mind. The King of England executed More on the 6th of July, 1535, for opposing divorce. On his execution, More was reported to have said, quote, "I die the king's good servant, and God's first." G.K. Chesterton counted More as the greatest historical character in English history. Imperfect man. The death penalty cannot be entrusted to the government because of widespread government, police, and prosecutorial corruption. The American adversarial system is designed so that the defense attorney puts the state to its burden of proof. The prosecutor, in contrast, seeks to advocate for truth and attain justice by following the law using admissible evidence. Judges are to impartially follow the law when disputes arise. Because of human failings, prosecutors often devolved into advocates for conviction. Remember that an accused is also a citizen. Thus, the state prosecutor owes just as much of a duty to the accused as to the victim of a crime. When advocating for guilt alone, the prosecutor unbalances the system. This is especially true because the state has enormous power and near unlimited resources. State prosecutors are human, subject to political pressure and clouded judgment. Unfortunately, this most often results in unfair implementation of the criminal procedures, especially when confronting the most heinous facts that have come in death penalty cases. This problem exhibits itself when attorney interactions begin. Often, prosecutors respond to defense attorney inquiries regarding law or facts with a resort to threats and obfuscation. It is all too common for prosecutors to withhold from the defense exculpatory evidence. There is only one prosecutor who has ever spent time in jail for misconduct that led to wrongful conviction. Prosecutor Ken Anderson served a 10-day sentence in Texas for misconduct that led to the wrongful conviction of Michael Morton. Unchecked and absolute power paves a wide path for wrongful convictions. Law enforcement officers are human. From a defense attorney perspective, the same attitude permeates depositions of law enforcement officers. Rather than providing their impartial observations in an open and helpful way, law enforcement officers often view the defense attorney as an enemy to be tricked, lied to, or stonewalled. This does not serve the interests of justice.
Nope.
This tendency is greatly magnified when the stakes in a case are serious, such as in a death penalty prosecution. A sloppy or incomplete investigation, just as much as planted or falsified evidence, can lead to wrongful conviction. Just like prosecutors, judges too often abandon their proper roles within the system. As imperfect humans, people inhabiting these roles all too easily succumb to popular opinion. Judges contemplating election challenges often result in judicial advocacy rather than fairness. The adversarial system relies on a strong defense bar to advocate for the accused. Defense attorneys are also imperfect, and less than perfect advocacy can result in a failure of the checks relied on to exculpate the not guilty. The legal assumption that defense attorneys are an all-knowing and untiring check on the system is just as wrong-headed. Over-reliance on jury verdicts is just as problematic. Juries make errors and are subject to the same human failings as the other participants in the system. To defer to a jury vote for a determination of truth is just another exercise in systematic hand-washing. Many proponents of the death penalty assert that appellate courts and the appellate process will stop any injustice. The appellate process is also imperfect. Every case of exoneration proves this point. For a current case, there is a notable ongoing case out of Oklahoma, the Glossop case, that shows that appellate courts do not place the possibility of innocence at the top of their priority list. In the Glossop case, the prosecutor and the defense agreed that a death penalty should be stayed in a written motion to the appellate court. Despite agreement by both parties, the Oklahoma appellate court refused to remove Mr. Glossop from death row. According to the Oklahoma appellate court, the interest in the finality of jury verdicts must rule over unjust trials. Thankfully, the Oklahoma Supreme Court has stepped in, but this shows that even when the parties agree, the court can go its own way. Appellate courts often weigh jury verdict and appellate finality versus problematic process. The Glossop example demonstrates the lack of protection from the appellate process. This is just an anomaly, right? An actually innocent person would be protected under federal law for sure. Not so fast. For a claim of actual innocence to even be considered under federal law, quote, a defendant is required to produce new reliable evidence, whether it be exculpatory scientific evidence, trustworthy eyewitness accounts, or critical physical evidence that was not presented at trial, end quote. Then additionally, quote, that new evidence must establish that it is more likely than not that no reasonable juror would have found petitioner guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, unquote, in light of all the available evidence. And in addition to that, in order to even be considered, the federal courts have required that defendants asserting actual innocence show that they have been diligent in presenting their claims. Thus, an actually innocent person who files a legally sufficient claim but did not, quote, diligently pursue their claims gets no relief under federal law. Wrongful conviction. There is a legitimate question regarding the actual calculus of wrongful convictions and the death penalty. In fairness, the number of crimes, quote, murders, that qualify for the death penalty greatly exceeds the number of false convictions. But by how much? Restated, what is the error rate of the criminal justice system.
Mm.
More specifically, what is the error rate in the criminal justice system of those persons sentenced to death? This is not a simple question at all. What people usually think of when they think of wrongful conviction are those persons who are sentenced to death but are actually innocent. There are many forms of wrongful convictions. Let us examine the ways this can be broken down. There are also those who are sentenced to death for first-degree murder when they are instead guilty of a lesser murder form. For example, they may be guilty of manslaughter, but not first-degree murder. There are also those who are sentenced to death who are incompetent, but the state shovels them through the system. There are those who are convicted on inadmissible evidence. There are those who are convicted when the evidence against them did not meet.
I meant to tell you. Write your questions down while you're listening. Oops, my bad. Have a think about what he said, and yeah, if you can come up with some questions, because I've got a few.
The beyond the reasonable doubt threshold. Just why do we think that every crime is solvable? Sometimes a crime is almost solved. Perhaps it is mostly solved. However, this does not mean the state proved a case beyond a reasonable doubt. We have a very significant case right here in our jurisdiction that illustrates this very point. In Dausch v. State, 2014, the case referenced earlier that my office division chief argued, Mr. Dausch's DNA was found in a car of a murder victim. Dausch argued that he was picked up in the car by two strangers whilst he was hitchhiking. No other evidence linked him to the murder. Despite this, he was convicted by a jury and sent to death row. Empowering the government to impose the death penalty on the worst of the worst also allows that power to be used against marginal cases and as a bargaining chip against people who are not guilty of first-degree murder. But
like, now that you say that, at least you've taken the time to hear both sides and you have made an informed, educated decision. Yeah? You're not just sprouting because next door neighbour said, you know? Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power, especially if you
but perhaps a lesser charge. Actual innocence. The problem of the death penalty being imposed on actual innocence cannot be overcome.
There's your argument. You can
the
actually
death penalty cannot be enshrined.
No, I have actually taken into account all of the issues, both with family, within the judicial system, the whole. I've heard it all, and I have made my decision.
Trusted to humanity, because imperfect humans administering any death penalty regime will result in error.
I wonder if some people are avoiding us today. I hope not. I just had a funny thought. Next time they come in after all those words that I wrote that I was telling you about in the email to ECR, they'll probably type a message and not, like, every one of them will be rejected.
Innocent people will die under any death penalty system. If you believe in the imperfection of man, then the death penalty will necessarily result in the execution of innocence.
I just hope that other people aren't avoiding, like, aren't here because of that.
According to the innocent.
Sorry, Anna. I don't mean to be cryptic. Have I got your email address, Anna? We had a bit of a if you go back and have a look at Saturday's chat, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, it got a bit heated.
Innocence Project's study of exonerations. The top reasons for wrongful conviction are erroneous eyewitness identifications, false and coerced confessions, inadequate legal defense, false or misleading forensic evidence, and false accusations or perjury by witnesses who are promised lenient treatment or other incentives in exchange for their testimony. The imposition of the death penalty short-circuits the possibility of proving actual innocence. What are the numbers? Many people have heard the phrase from English jurist William Blackstone, quote, "Better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer," end quote. Ben Franklin upped the number by stating, quote, "It is better 100 guilty persons should escape than one innocent person should suffer," end quote. Does this hold up for 1,000? 10,000? 1,000,000? Perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. We cannot know the actual numbers of persons that are innocent serving on death row. But we can agree that it's generally true that there are more guilty murderers than there are innocents on death row. Since
So I just had a look at the poll. It's divided. 36% fuck yeah, I'm in. 9% say, yeah, I might have a bevy with you. 27% nah, continue telling the death penalty story. And 27% say, maybe, John Jody sounds like fun. That's really inconclusive. Well, the majority at least has spoken.
1973, 30 innocent people have been exonerated from Florida's death row, the highest number of any state in the U.S. Innocent does not mean they were found not guilty. This means that they were actually innocent, but placed on death row. That calculates to nearly 1 exoneration for every 3 Florida executions during that same period. For the death penalty generally, the statistic is 1 in 8. That is, for every 8 people executed, 1 person on death row has been exonerated. Of the people proven innocent and exonerated by DNA testing in the United States after serving time on death row, they served a combined 229 years in prison, including 202 years on death row for crimes they did not commit. As a matter of statistics, there must be people who are innocent, but have no evidentiary ability to prove their innocence. For example, a case with no exculpatory DNA. How many cases does this cover? There is really no way to know. Many people who watched the recent murder conviction of Zachariah Anderson would attest to this. It is true that a life in prison sentence is equivalent to a death sentence drawn out over many years, with the difference that the human death is unaided by human intervention. With a life sentence, if proven innocent later, a person can be released and try to have a normal life again. A person released many years after a conviction of murder will have lost irreplaceable years. This precious lost freedom is unrecoverable. But life is not recoverable after a wrongful execution. Neither punishment should be taken lightly. Culture of death. The death penalty encourages a culture of death. When the answer to the question is death, then life is undermined. The culture of death in Western civilization is strong. We are in fact on a reverse slippery slope, wherein death is viewed increasingly as a solution to many problems. How many agree that the state should assist with suicide to help those with fatal illnesses suffering in a great deal of pain? How about assisted suicide for teenagers and the depressed? If that line is crossed, how about killing the homeless and the poor? Is that a reasonable solution to poverty and homelessness? A recent study in Canada found that 1 in 4 Canadians agree with euthanizing the poor. Among those 18 to 34, 40% support death for the poor. Canadians are split when pondering if mental illness should be a justification for an adult to seek medical assistance in dying. 43% support this idea, while 45% are opposed. That is 1 in 4 on board with euthanasia for the poor and the homeless. Among the 18 to 34 crowd, it's 40%. The endorsement of death by the state using executions may in fact increase the murder rate around the time of the execution. This may be because the imprimatur of the state is placed on death as a solution. Societal endorsement of death as a solution to a problem should be rejected. Some pro-death penalty advocates propose that the solution to prosecutorial misconduct is to place the badly behaving attorney in the place of the wrongfully convicted. In the death penalty arena, this means putting the prosecutor on death row when they wrongfully convict an innocent person. Put the prosecutors away who wrongfully convict. Have them suffer the same punishments as the person they wronged. As a criminal defense attorney, this does give me pause as proper comeuppance. But in all seriousness, this is simply using death as a solution to yet another of mankind's problems. When death is an acceptable answer to a problem, there seems to be no problem that it does not solve. What is the alternative system? Some people say the true problem is that it is too hard to execute people. These individuals cry, death for cheating prosecutors, death for child rapists, death for wrongful accusers, death for everyone without mercy and delay. Is this a society you wish to live in? Redemption. The death penalty forecloses the possibility of redemption. When most people hear about redemption, they think about redemption for the condemned. Why should we care about the soul of a murderer? The death penalty also forecloses the opportunity for the survivors to seek redemption. An advocate for the death penalty who proposes to speak for a victim or a victim's family assumes that the victim or all the victim's family members would endorse a death penalty for the murderer. This is absolutely not true. Some family members of a murder victim may be adamantly opposed to the death penalty. The pro-life survivors may feel that the death penalty stains them with partial responsibility for the execution. Why is their voice not important in the equation? Just who speaks for the family of the victim? Is there really a family consensus? What if the family is 7-5 against the death penalty? Does this mean the state will only seek life in prison? What if the more assertive personalities bully the pro-life in prison family members into silence? Why does the prosecution team only value the pro-death penalty family members? At a time when families most need unity, the death penalty divides. Our office recently handled a death penalty case where a father was charged with the death of his infant son. In the months leading up to trial, the entirety of the victim's family begged the state attorney's office not to seek the death penalty. The prosecutors sought death anyways. The family continued to beg for a life sentence after our client was convicted at trial of felony murder, and the state attorney's office continued to ignore their impassioned pleas for mercy. The prosecutors successfully prevented the jury from ever hearing the family's wishes. It was 11 a.m. when the jury reached a verdict. As the jury filed in, the family of the defendant and his victim crowded the seating behind the defendant and our Seventh Circuit public defender team. The pews behind the state were empty. The jury chose life. The victim's grandmother, the head of the family, texted the defense team, "Thank God and thank you. Now I can finally grieve." Even if the family is unified in their pro-death position early on, the death penalty includes the possibility of survivors being visited later by regret for their position as those survivors grow in faith. The alternative, life in prison without the possibility of parole, allows for the state to say to the surviving family, "We will lock this person up for the rest of their life. They will never see freedom again and will leave that prison in a box." If any family member ever wishes to confront, question, or forgive, the perpetrator will be there. The alternative allows for the maximum possibility of redemption for everyone. Many pro-death advocates begin the debate with, "How would you feel if your wife was murdered?" Obviously, the emotional sense of vengeance grows within every individual's belly. Failure to acknowledge the political appeal of emotion is also a mistake. As we discussed earlier, appeals to emotion should not be the basis for our decision-making towards the question of the death penalty as a public policy matter. Our families are the closest to us, and this bond fuels rage against anyone who would take away your spouse. But what if it was your only child who killed your spouse?
Oh.
If a child kills a parent, would the surviving parent want the death of their only son? I can honestly say that if my son were to in some way kill my wife and I not only would not want him to face the death penalty, I would want him to face no penalty at all. I'm not encouraging anything, mind you. Death penalty advocates may argue that redemption for the victims is available regardless of the penalty. For example, on June 17, 2015, South Carolina killer Dylan Roof, a white supremacist, walked into a Bible study and murdered 9 Black Americans. The response of the Christian congregation to that unspeakable
Morning,
act is a
sunshine.
lesson to all of us
Sorry,
in forgiveness and healing. The film Emmanuel.
I wasn't downloading Lindsay Chamberlain stuff. Ignoring the chat. Not at all. What was that? Oh. We were discussing, I did a poll on whether or not I should do a New Year's Eve celebratory stream that involved possibly earning for every $10 super chat I have to take a shot. Because I figured you've seen Happy Jody, you've seen Sad Jody, you've seen Snoring Jody. You might as well meet Drunk Jody. Drunk Jody I haven't met for 10 years, so yeah. Oh, you going out? Have you got plans? Well, I couldn't work out whether I do it my New Year's Eve or yours. Yeah, he's going to pick up. Yeah. Where are you off to? You're going to join us. I think Miss Mandy's going to do it, and Tan as well, perhaps. You get 3 of us bitches drunk. That will be funny.
Is the story of the victims and survivors of that night. However, Mr. Roof is currently on death row.
I'm going to stop this.
In contrast, Jacksonville, Florida father Ike Brown ended up adopting the man who murdered his son. This incredible story is an analogy of God's love for us. Some opportunities for redemption will be erased when a death sentence is carried out. Religious objections. For people of faith, if the faith determines that the death penalty is not allowed, then that should be the end of the question. If, however, the religion allows for the death penalty, then further inquiry must be made. As a Christian, I will speak for my humble understanding of Christianity and the death penalty. Moral law existed from the beginning. The book of Genesis tells the story of the first murder, that of Cain and Abel. Notably, God's punishment.
To answer your question, because I'm halfway through typing a message back to you. I fell asleep on you and then forgot to check back in there. I might put some Discord. What have we got? A desert, rainforest, and a coral reef, a barrier reef. You forgot the inbred part, which is Tasmania. The rainforesty bits right up the top near Darwin, because obviously it's closer to the equator. And then the further you come down, the colder it gets. Pretty much like New Zealand, I suppose. But I'm down the bottom in Melbourne, so it's just typical, normal, everyday. Lots of gum trees with koalas in them, and kangaroos in the backyard, and a couple of echidnas and 3 emus, kookaburras, cockies. It's a house with grass and plants and a driveway with an empty bus, well, a rusting bus sitting in it. I should say.
For Cain's murder of Abel was like.
I'll look for some. I'll look for some photos of the bus. I've got them saved somewhere.
Life outside of Eden. Soon, Yahweh established covenants with the Hebrew people, as laid out in the Old Testament or Torah. The concept of an eye for an eye is found in the book of Genesis 9:6 and the book of Exodus 21:23-27. The Old Testament commandment was meant to moderate vengeance. The punishment should not exceed the injury done. Pro-death penalty Christians often point to these and other Old Testament passages for their support of the death penalty. Because adultery, murder, slavery, and genocide are discussed in the Bible, that does not mean they are authorized by God. Did not Moses commit first-degree murder in Exodus 2:11-22? Was God's response death to Moses? In the Old Testament, the death penalty was administered for a whole host of crimes.
Really?
This does not mean that death for adultery is biblically sanctioned. Does not Jesus show the response to a death penalty offense is mercy in John 8:1-11? The Christian New Testament is a new covenant with God extended to all people. A further error is reading the acknowledgement of authority as endorsement of the justice of that authority. A human may have the power of death, but not the moral endorsement of God. Finally, even if the death penalty is biblically allowed, that does not answer the question that we have as citizens and that is whether it is good public policy. As a Christian, Jesus forbids even some proportionate retaliation. As told in Matthew 5:38-48, Jesus, at the
Hell.
Sermon on the Mount,
Hell.
you have
Hell.
heard
Doesn't
that
work.
it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your right cheek,
You're running
turn
around
the
doing
other one to
errands.
him as well.
It's my life.
The desire for vengeance is condemned in Christian theology. Romans 12:19, quote, Beloved, do not look for revenge, but leave room for the
okay.
wrath. For it is capital punishment. In his encyclical, Evangelium Vitae Trial, was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been deployed, which ensure the due protection of the citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death of the death penalty. Each side has numerous examples that they cite in support of their position. There is no way to capture all of these cases, so I have chosen a representative few. When an advocate for the death penalty brings up an example, it is often someone who, in their opinion, should have received the death penalty. There are other examples of people who have received the death penalty, but are so extreme that the life in prison advocate is hard-pressed to defend the individual. Here is a representative sample of cases that death penalty proponents often use. Timothy McVeigh. On April 19, 1995, Mr. McVeigh detonated a truck full of explosives outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, in revenge for the federal actions at Waco and Ruby Ridge. The bombing killed 168 people, 19 of whom were children, and injured 680. This was the deadliest act of terrorism before the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. McVeigh was executed June 11, 2001. This terroristic fact pattern challenges opponents of the death penalty. Ted Bundy. Bundy is the poster boy for infamous serial killers, with 20 victims and over 36 suspected. His crimes spanned 5 years between 1974 and 1978. Bundy was executed in Florida on January 24, 1989. Bundy is an example of how imprisonment does not bar the possibility of escape, with Bundy having escaped from jail both on June 7, 1977 to June 13, 1977, and between December 30th, 1977 and February 15th, 1978, when he killed his last victims. Note that he did not escape from prison or death row, but instead from local jails. Dylan Roof. On June 17th, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof entered Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Emmanuel AME is one of the oldest Black churches in the United States, and it has long been a center for civil rights organizing. Mr. Roof was an avowed racist who wanted to divide Americans by race and start a race war. Roof sat among the Black parishioners, listening to the discussions of the Bible study group. He then drew a firearm, threatening and cursing the Bible study group. When he opened fire, he killed 9 souls, including the senior pastor, State Senator Clementa C. Pinckney. Roof was sentenced to death for the murders. There is an excellent documentary about the Christian forgiveness of the parish towards Roof called Emmanuel. Adolf Hitler. Godwin's law is in full effect during any death penalty debate. This is the rule that as a discussion grows longer, regardless of topic or scope, the probability of a comparison to Nazis or Adolf Hitler approaches 100%. If there is any prototypical example of an evil person deserving of the death penalty, it is the leader of the Nazi Party himself. As the architect of the murders of millions of innocents, removing the death penalty from the list of options is hard to defend. While the mustached one escaped the death penalty via suicide, many of Hitler's fellow Nazi leaders were executed by the Allies after the end of the war. Of course, there is the rule that the first person who resorts to Hitler as an argumentative example loses the debate. Regardless, the Nazi situation may be better characterized as an act of war addressed earlier rather than part of any criminal process. Not all examples cited by supporters of the death penalty refer to situations in which it was administered. The following are examples of people who received a life sentence, whom advocates assert should have been sentenced to death. Nicholas Cruz. On February 14, 2018, 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz opened fire on students and staff at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, murdering 17 people and injuring 17 others. During the penalty phase, defense attorneys mounted a vigorous defense, with 9 jurors voting for death and 3 jurors voting for life. Because a death sentence requires unanimity, Mr. Cruz was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Cruz's life sentence generated significant backlash in popular opinion and has been a primary motivating factor for Florida Governor DeSantis's push to expand the use of the death penalty, including 8-4 recommendations sufficient for death. To fully understand the issues involved in Mr. Cruz's life sentence, I would recommend you watch the entire penalty phase closing arguments. In it, Mr. Cruz's youth and childhood background were featured by the defense team. James Holmes. 24-year-old James Holmes entered a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Dressed as the Joker from the Batman comic series, Holmes set off tear gas grenades and shot into the audience with multiple firearms. 12 people were killed and 70 others were injured, 58 of them from gunfire. To fully understand the issues involved in Mr. Holmes's life sentence, I would recommend you watch the entire penalty phase closing arguments. Holmes's struggles with mental illness feature prominently in his defense appeals for mercy, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Chapter 10. Cases cited by opponents of the death penalty. Comparing the list of pro-death penalty examples with those cited below, one has to wonder, why do we not know any of the names of those who were exonerated? People wish to look away from mistakes within the system. To confront the terrible reality of wrongful conviction is to lose faith in the system. I say, good. Faith should only be placed in God. Faith in a man-made system is idolatry. Another reason may be that the media tends to emphasize sensationalist crimes, and the state actors have no interest in airing their dirty laundry. Regardless, each side has numerous examples that they cite in support of their position. There is no way to capture all of these cases, so I have chosen a representative few. Here is a sample of cases that opponents of the death penalty often use when advocating their position. Frank Lee Smith. On April 15, 1985, 8-year-old Chandra Whitehead died from injuries sustained from an attack in her home by a burglar. Repeated blows from a blunt object, later found to be a rock, in addition to attempted strangulation, contributed to the victim's death. An autopsy revealed that the girl had been raped and sodomized. Through eyewitness descriptions from 2 neighbors, Miss Lowe and one other, as well as the victim's mother, the investigation came to be centered on a black male, about 6 feet tall, with muscular upper arms, shoulders, and chest, a dark complexion, about 30 years old, and wearing an orange t-shirt and jeans. Lowe testified that on her way home, she was flagged down by an unidentified black male with a full beard, scraggly hair, and droopy eye. From a composite sketch the police put together with the witnesses, Frank Lee Smith was arrested. At the jury trial, the prosecution presented the identification of Smith by the victim's mother and Smith's criminal history. She identified him as the man she saw leaving her home through the living room window on the night of the murder. At trial, the defense's insanity plea failed, and the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. A death warrant was signed by Florida Governor Martinez in 1998, but the Florida Supreme Court stayed the execution, ordering a trial judge to hold an evidentiary hearing based on the changed testimony of Eyewitness Lowe. Eyewitness Lowe changed her story, having been shown a picture of another suspect by a defense investigator. The death penalty was put off in 1990. Smith remained on death row. On January 30th, 2000, 14 years after the murder, Mr. Smith died of cancer on death row. On December 15th, 2000, 11 months after his death, Frank Lee Smith was exonerated based on exculpatory DNA testing results. These results not only cleared Smith of the crime, but identified the true perpetrator, Eddie Lee Mosley, a convicted rapist and murderer currently living in the Tacachella State Center for the Intellectually Disabled Defendants in Gainesville, Florida.
Wow.
George Junius Stinney Jr. On March 23, 1944, 2 young girls, Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 7, were found bludgeoned to death in Alcolu, South Carolina. The next day, police arrested George Stinney for the murders. The entire proceeding against Stinney, including jury selection, took place on April 24, 1944. Mr. Stinney was executed by electric chair on June 16, 1944. While Mr. Stinney's case may or may not be one of actual innocence, it is one that is often cited by opponents of the death penalty. Why? Mr. Stinney was born on October 21st, 1929, making him 14 at the time of his execution. Stinney was not allowed to see his parents until after his trial and conviction. While Mr. Stinney was a Black American youth, the Southern jury was all white. Overall, the process afforded to Mr. Stinney was so lacking that no reliability can be placed on the outcome of the trial. Stinney is the youngest American with an exact birth date confirmed to be sentenced to death and executed in the 20th century. Sharif Cousin. On March 2nd, 1995, Michael Girardi and his date, Connie Babin, were leaving a restaurant in New Orleans. 3 teenage black males approached the couple. Girardi yelled at Babin to run away. As she was running, she turned around and saw one of the teens shoot Girardi in the face, killing him. A suspect, 16-year-old Sharif Cousin, was implicated by James Roel, a former friend who was seeking leniency for charges he faced arising from several robberies. Police put Cousin in a lineup and Babin picked him out. Miss Babin testified at trial that she was absolutely positive that she had seen Cousin commit the murder. The case against Mr. Cousin was based almost exclusively on eyewitness identification. No physical evidence linked Cousin to the crime scene. Several defense witnesses insisted Cousin had been playing in a youth league basketball game at the time of the murder. A video of the game was even presented in court. Mr. Cousin was found guilty and sentenced to death as a juvenile in Louisiana. At age 17, he became the youngest condemned convict to be put on death row in Louisiana and one of the youngest in the United States. During appeals, several instances of prosecutorial misconduct and withholding of exculpatory evidence were discovered in the case. For example, Miss Babin initially told police she could not identify the shooter as she wasn't wearing her glasses. But this statement was not disclosed to the defense. Roswell testified that he was coerced to falsely implicate Cousin in exchange for a reduced sentence on other charges. Cousin's conviction and death sentence were overturned in 1998. The district attorney dropped the case, saying there was not sufficient evidence for a second trial. No one else has been prosecuted for the murder. The case of Sharif Cousin is an example of the unreliable nature of eyewitness testimony. Gary Gauger. On April 8, 1993, Morris and Ruth Gauger, the parents of Mr. Gary Gauger, were murdered. Mr. Gauger's throat had been slit, and he was left to bleed to death on the floor of his shop. Ruth Gauger was killed on the floor of the small rug and trinket shop she operated in McHenry County Couples Farm. The next day, Gary Gauger called 911, reporting that he had found his 74-year-old father's body. Responding officers from the McHenry County Sheriff's Department soon also found the body of 70-year-old Ruth Gauger. Gauger told officers he was asleep when his parents were murdered. Gauger was interrogated for 21 hours by police. Officers lied to Gauger and told him that they had found evidence against him. Quote, "They told me that they found bloody clothes in my bedroom. They found a bloody knife in my pocket," quote, he said. After showing Gauger gruesome photographs of his parents, Gauger broke down and confessed. Though Gauger had no memory of the crime, he believed what the police had told him. Quote, "I thought I must have done it in a blackout," he said. Though he had given a confession, there was no physical evidence held against him in court. Gauger was found guilty of the double murder and was sentenced to death. On March 8, 1996, an Illinois appellate court threw out Gary's confession. The court found that the statements were the product of a wrongful arrest made without probable cause and therefore should not have been admitted at trial. Gauger ultimately spent nearly 2 years in prison and 9 months on death row before being released in March of 1996. In 2004, 2 Wisconsin Outlaws Motorcycle Club members, Randall E. Miller and James W. Schneider, were charged and convicted in the double murder of Morris and Ruth Gauger. Mr. Gauger is an example of a conviction using a false confession. Ray Crone. In 1991, 35-year-old bartender Kim Ancona was found dead in a Phoenix, Arizona bar where Cone often played darts. Expert testimony presented by the state asserted that an impression of Crone's teeth matched bite marks found on the victim's body. Because of this scientific evidence, the media dubbed him the Snaggletooth Killer. Crone was convicted in 1992, and that conviction was upheld on appeal in 1996. Mr. Crone spent 10 years in prison, including 2 years on death row. On April 8, 2002, DNA evidence proved that he did not murder Miss Ancona and identified the real killer, Kenneth Phillips, a repeatedly violent sexual offender. After the exoneration, it came out that ample crime scene evidence and interviews should have excluded Crone as the suspect.
He's got a
And
bit of a
all pointed
variety
towards-
on there, doesn't he? He's got all his law stuff. He's even got his, like him making arguments in federal court. In the Supreme Court. Yeah, plants, and there's something else that he does too, isn't there? I can't remember. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. That's not
Bruce
unusual.
Phillips. But this data was ignored by the police and the prosecution's purported experts. Since Crone's release, he has been working for the abolition of the death penalty, along with the organization Witness to Innocence. For more on the debunked bite mark science, read Chris Fabricant's excellent book titled Junk Science and the American Criminal Justice System. Mr. Crone's case is an example of conviction using junk science.
I think we could give Steve Gosney a better example of
Ricky Ray
bite
Rector.
mark expert.
On March 21st, 1981, Rector and some friends drove to a dance hall at Tommy's old-fashioned home-style restaurant in Conway, Arkansas. When one friend who
Gonna
could
like
not pay
him.
the
He's lovely. I actually had a meeting with him the other day, like backstage, and yeah, he's sitting there talking to me, and then his wife pops in and says, "Hi!" He's so excited to come and do this podcast. Oh my God, someone's taking interest in my shit. It's funny as.
$3 cover charge was refused entry, Rector became incensed and pulled a .38 caliber pistol from his waistband. He fired several shots, wounding 2 and killing Arthur D. Criswell, who died almost instantly after being struck in the throat and forehead. While on the run, Rector agreed to surrender only to Officer Robert Martin, whom he had known since he was a child. Upon arrival, Rector fired 2 shots into Officer Martin, striking him in the jaw and neck. Rector then put his gun to his own temple and fired. This resulted in severe injury, effectively destroying his brain's front lobe. Rector was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. On January 24th, 1992, Rector was executed after then Arkansas Governor William Jefferson Clinton signed his death warrant. Many outside observers believe Clinton used the execution to distract from his many personal scandals and show that he was, quote, tough on crime. Mr. Rector is often cited as an example of the wrongful execution of the mentally infirmed. Rector's lack of perception is illustrated by his decision to save his pecan pie dessert from his last meal for later, which would have been after his execution.
So is that where the Richter scale came from? Sorry.
Nazi Germany. Recognizing Godwin's law as a counter to the Hitler example, a death penalty opponent can point out that the Third Reich made death sentences a core part of their policy. The death penalty was vigorously imposed even early in the regime. Death became a solution to many state problems, such as mental illness and infirmity. Soon, the, quote, solution was expanded into other areas. Enemies of the state were quickly executed under the aegis of law.
I'm waiting for that.
The fully legal and encouraged death penalty in the German state resulted in the murders of millions of innocents. Whether the removal of the...
I've been going down the death penalty rabbit hole, trust me. Like state by state.
The death penalty from legal punishment would have stopped the Nazi regime is an open question. But advocates for quick, efficient, and broadly applied capital punishment must deal with this negative state-sanctioned example. As stated earlier, be aware of the rule that the first person who resorts to Hitler as an argumentative example loses the debate. Jesus Christ. The state put absolute innocence to death.
Really?
Chapter 11. Weight the questions yourself. Let us return to the question posed in the beginning of this book. Is the death penalty a net positive or a net negative for society?
Oh, really?
How do you weigh the arguments? What follows is an outline of the arguments that we just discussed. Now, I know that you may have discerned my position, but I have tried to be as fair and inclusive of both sides as I can possibly be. Again, if you think I have not adequately addressed your favorite reasoning, please email me.
I'm not into all the bullshit that's going on now, and all the arguments and all the bloody, oh my God. Right, fuck. I am pro Karen Reid, and I'm happy to support her, but I'm not interested in getting involved in any bullshit. It's just gotten out of control. Way, way out of control. And they're all just cashing in on it.
There may be a second edition, and your contribution can only make the book better. But this is an exercise for you to examine where you stand. Go through each of the arguments for yourself. Try assigning a weight that you think should be attached to that argument. Maybe 1 equals not weighty at all, and 10 equals extremely weighty. Be aware that some arguments may be decisive for you. For example, it may be that 10 on the religious question would automatically default to anti-death. Death penalty is a net positive.
Yeah.
1.
I don't do
the death penalty satisfies vengeance.
Good time.
2. The death penalty provides for better incapacitation than does life in prison.
Well, basically, it comes down to if you watch the medical examiner's report and what his injuries were, where they were, and what they were, and then the apparent damage to the car. But watch the two ARCA. So basically, the defence's witnesses, I think they only put on, was it 4 or 6? Because in my mind, this woman's been charged with murder. So John's actual cause of death was blunt force trauma to the rear of the skull, and it was a 2-inch straight line laceration to the back of his head that caused massive internal hemorrhaging, skull fractures, swelling. It was a contra-Q, what they call a contra-Q impact. So the impact hit that hard that the brain reverberated, hit the front part of the skull. And that's where the bruising came out. That's why his eyes were all bruised and puffed out like that, because that's where the swelling, that bruising hit the front. So the impact came from the back and hit the front internally. Then he had lacerations down his right arm, which is they're attributing to dog bites. But nothing else in the trial matters. Nothing. Cause of death and how that occurred. And I cannot even contemplate how that injury occurred by a vehicle going in reverse. The actual physical position that he would have had to have been in to have sustained that injury and sustained a 2-inch straight laceration injury, not a bump from a bumper or a tail light, a straight to the back of his head. No bruising, no broken bones anywhere else. So like most traffic accidents, they hit the lower extremities, you get broken legs, hips, knees, nothing else from the neck down pretty much, apart from his right arm. So it doesn't even matter if they're dog bites as far as I'm concerned, because they didn't cause his death at the end of the day. So it comes down to the cause of death and how he sustained those injuries. And I'm sorry, but the Lexus, it's still just the laws of physics. And then not only would he have had to have been in a particular position, like upside down, facing backwards, and then there would have had to have been something that would have caused that singular straight laceration to the back of his head, whether it be the hitch of a tow ball or something. But he would have had to have been bent forward, head away from the car somehow, and then thrown 15 feet towards the house. It doesn't add up. That's all it comes down to. And I'm more than happy to listen to how you came to that. I would love to know what your argument is. Yeah, I don't do drama, I don't do politics, and I don't do religion at all. Otherwise, I would have had a politically religious channel. But as I said in the thing, there is elements of politics that affect this topic, so that needs to be incorporated into it. But the actual agenda of pushing your personal political agenda, no.
3,
Sorry.
the death penalty is proportional to the crime of murder in a way that life in prison is not. 4, the death penalty is equitable in that without the death penalty, society is valuing the life of the murderer over the life of the innocent victim. 5, the death penalty should exist as the highest punishment. 6. The protections afforded by the system are sufficient for the death penalty to be an option. 7. Persons who get the death penalty get much greater appellate review. 8. The death penalty provides for specific deterrence. 9. The death penalty provides a general deterrence. 10. The death penalty is less costly than life in prison. The death penalty is a net negative. 1. Life in prison is sufficient as it is extremely harsh.
Please explain.
2. The death penalty is a lie. 3.
Don't
The
lie.
death penalty is a distraction from more important
lie.
issues. 4. The death penalty is arbitrary.
Yes, pretty much. Well,
5. The death penalty
just
does
quite
not
a
deter
few.
crime.
It's potentially a little less vocabulary that will be accepted in chat from now on. Why is it not? Why is it rejected? Why? Don't know.
6. The death penalty is more costly than life in prison. 7. The death penalty complicates international relations. 8. The death penalty undermines state authority. 9. The death penalty violates the principle of limited
Obviously.
government. 10. Systematic problems with the death penalty cannot be overcome.
Yeah, I didn't
11.
up that one
The
because
death penalty is government
that one
authorized
won't be
murder.
said.
12. The death penalty contributes to moral rot. 13. The death penalty creates destabilizing martyrs. 14. The death penalty
off,
cannot be entrusted to imperfect men.
I've tried to stop swearing.
15. The possibility of wrongful conviction forecloses the death penalty. 16. The danger is too great of executing someone who is actually
Just
innocent.
proved it. Yep.
17. The death penalty encourages a culture of death. 18. The death penalty forecloses the possibility of
Yeah,
redemption.
they can.
19. The death
Well,
penalty offends your religious faith. Now put those two sides on your own personal scale of justice. Which way does your scale lean?
I've got nothing against swear words at all. I've probably got one of the. Well, I could potentially have one of the worst potty mouths. If you tell me not to swear, yeah, I kind of do the opposite. But that's with anything. Don't tell me not to do something.
Chapter 12. Conclusory thoughts.
Don't tell me
Most
to do
people who
something
have heard me
either.
speak know that I am against the death penalty. First, I am a faithful Catholic Christian, and my faith ultimately settles the question for me.
You have to edit with religion.
However, even removing this from my analysis, I believe that after weighing the issues as laid out in this book, capital punishment is a net public policy negative. It is only
Yeah.
fair that I should lay my cards on the table. But I do not think
is
this should
very-
undermine the arguments laid out in this.
He's very non-biased. He's laid out the facts, and he has been like super neutral. He's voiced his opinion, but he hasn't forced it, and that's what I like.
book. I have solicited and continue to solicit from others arguments that I may have overlooked. If you feel your argument was not fairly presented, please send me those arguments. There may be a second edition,
People
and the
ask
inclusion of
what's
your
wrong with
arguments can
internet
only
when
make
you
the book
swear.
better. How do we move past the unresolvable?
But-
Moral teachings should educate us on the
My-
death penalty.
My argument is that, okay, the word fuck, it has so many uses. Like it is just, it's, you can go, you fuck. Okay, what the fuck? And you could go, fuck you. Or you could go, about fuck. Well, fuck me. It's just, it can be used in any way. It's limitless. Its boundaries are limitless. For fuck's sake. Oh,
An ethical analysis is by nature an individual pursuit. Just as a corporation or government does not have an ethical will of its own,
you
a
fucking
group
kidding me.
does not hold a moral conscience. The criminal justice system attempts to cloud the responsibility away from any one individual by systematizing the administration of justice. One example of this is that when an execution is carried out by firing squad, one bullet is a blank. This allows for the individual shooter within the firing line to always question his absolute moral responsibility for execution by relying on the possibility that his own shot was the blank. Similarly, in Florida, the system imposing the death penalty requires the jury to reconvene after a guilty verdict to decide whether to recommend the death penalty to the judge. If a majority decides that the death penalty should be imposed, then the judge must consider whether to sentence the defendant to death or to life in prison. The system provides mechanisms for individuals to subserviate themselves to the group. They can get behind a group decision to hide from their own personal moral responsibility. But there is no escape from oneself, and by extension, one's own moral responsibility when voting death. Everyone involved in the process has their own moral conscience to deal with when playing their part in a flawed system. This question really boils down to what the role of an individual is in a flawed system. When the system is unjust and the individuals empowering that system know it, what is the proper response? Should they continue to abdicate their responsibility because they have no individual power to effect a change in that system? A problem within the death penalty process is that individuals with moral objections are systematically excluded from the system. If a person begins acting contrary to the policy, they are bounced right out of the system for failing to do their job. Standing up for your individual moral beliefs may disempower a person from effecting change. Individual morality is at the core of the American idea. Individual rights are guaranteed under the United States Constitution. Despite this, a prosecutor can screen jurors for their opinion on the death penalty. If a person is morally opposed to the death penalty, they can be stricken from the jury for cause. While this seems procedurally correct, hypothesize what would happen if the great majority of a community opposes the death penalty. Would that not allow for a small minority of people to steer the verdict against the will of the majority? Recognizing that the system is flawed may just exclude you from participation in parts of the system where change is most needed. Individuals cannot ignore their moral obligations by claiming bureaucracy or politics is to blame. Politics set up the death penalty system. Ceding individual responsibility for one's vote is in fact disempowering the system that exists to free men from wrongful condemnation. Similarly, when in a group, being for death in all cases is simply passing the buck for a responsibility that lies with everyone.
I forgot.
Always voting for death is an abdication of individual moral responsibility. As Edmund Burke once said, your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. Allow me to make a few additional observational points that do not fit in the overall framework. It is my book. When I was in the state attorney's office, I was on track to become a capital prosecutor. I had attended the death penalty prosecutor training and was being groomed for the position by the elected state attorney. At that time, a state attorney investigator communicated to me a prosecutor credential after gaining a death penalty conviction. They called those who obtain a death sentence as having dipped their hands in blood. As someone who at the time wanted the promotion to capital prosecutor, this struck me as morally repugnant. Thankfully, I was sent to the other side of the bar. God works in mysterious ways. Search your own soul. Do your own thinking. Weigh the arguments for yourself. Make up your own mind in an educated way, and always do your best.
Exactly.
Peace be with you.
My sentiments exactly. Now.
Death penalty debates.
What?
Net pause.
Stop. All right. Shouldn't have put a snake in my mouth right then. So, I remember when my eldest was 2, and I was heavily pregnant with my second, like, just about to pop. And we'd gone to the supermarket, and I was carrying bags of groceries up the stairs with my handbag and a toddler and heavily pregnant. And I've got the keys out of my handbag to unlock the front door. And I've dropped them. I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake. Well, my 2-year-old pretty much spent the entire rest of the day saying, oh, for fuck's sake. she had the tone, the whole lot down pat. So yeah. I hear everything. And then some. All right, my lovelies. I obviously need my beauty sleep. So you're out in the town tomorrow for New Year's Eve, Edahef. Is that what you're telling us? All right, I'm going to try and convince Tanya. So I won't do a stream in the morning. I will do one that starts at your 10 p.m. New Year's Eve. So that's, I think, my 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I think. Ah, cool. Are you going camping? You watch out for them bears. What was I saying? Yeah, I think it's 2 o'clock. Yeah. I'll find out. So, yeah. Best I get my shot glasses out and my Baileys and my butterscotch schnapps. What's going on with these bloody things? Anywho. Yep. Yes. I agree. I definitely have. And that's only one. I've actually got the other two books in PDF form, so I've got to read them. I'm going to try and convince someone to come and help me. They're not huge, but yeah, I might be able to read them all. Plus, it's more fun if two people do it. You can put voices and shit on. So I'm organising to start. We're doing all our background shit for the Lindsay Chamberlain trial next week. I'm doing all the shit and marketing for the podcast. This is part of my research. So I'm going to get through 2 books before then and set up the stream. And run a New Year's Eve thon. And yeah, I'm busy. Busy beaver. I could actually pre-record. I could read it out loud and record my voice so that there's parts that I could take a rest at. Yeah, the brain dead. All right, my darlings. I go nice with my little furry black man. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for hanging, and I'll see you next year. Oh, a couple of hours before. Oh dear. Oh, we could even do it. Oh, that's another good idea. Oh, what did someone do? It was I think it was for whatever the amount of super chats came to, that the the host had to log on to Temu and spend half of that buy shit that that everyone in chat was telling them to buy. I think that might be funny too. I could end up with some funny shit. All right. I'm going to bed. I'm delirious. I know. Love you all. Good, isn't it? Ah. Bye.
Justice served in an honest fight. True crime tales till the verdict's right. Solving more than just trivial quests, where sentences rule at the defense rests. Justice served in an honest fight. True crime tales till the verdict's right. Solving more than just trivial quests, where sentences rule and the defense rests.